The gate was chained shut. That was the first thing Evelyn Hartwell noticed, not the cold that had eaten through her coat 2 days ago. Not the way her fingers had stopped hurting, because they had stopped feeling anything at all, but the chain. Heavy iron links wrapped twice around the post, padlocked with something that looked like it hadn't been opened since before she was born. On the other side of that gate, smoke rose from a chimney. Firelight pressed orange against a single window. Someone was warm in there. Someone was eating supper. She was standing in the Wyoming dark with a battered trunk she could no longer lift, and $11 folded into the lining of her left boot because she'd learned 3 states ago not to keep money anywhere a man could reach it. She had traveled 900 miles for a job that had burned to the ground 4 months before she arrived. If you've ever stood somewhere and understood with total clarity that there was no plan left, that every backup had failed and every bridge was behind you, and the road ahead simply stopped, then you already know what Evelyn felt standing at that gate. And if you've never felt that, watch closely, because what she did next is the only reason this story exists. She sat down on her trunk and she waited. Before we go further, if this is your first time here, welcome. Stories like Evelyn's are what this channel is built for. Real characters, hard winters, the kind of choices that don't have a good answer, only a true one. If that's what you're looking for, hit subscribe so you don't miss what's coming next. And while you're at it, drop a like and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far Evelyn's story travels. Now let's go back to that gate. She had left Philadelphia in early November with a letter of employment from the Caldwell Hotel in Cheyenne, a reference from her previous employer, a boarding house, where she'd worked for 6 years, managing the kitchen and linen, and $34 saved over the course of a decade of careful living. The letter was signed by a man named Gerald Foss, who had described the position as housekeeper for a newly rebuilt establishment with accommodations for 40 guests and a full kitchen staff of 3. Room and board included, $12 a month. It was more than she had ever been offered. It was more than she had ever asked for. She has not told anyone she was leaving because there was no one who needed to know. Her mother had died in the spring. Her brother had his own family in Maryland, and they had exchanged letters twice in 5 years, politely, the way people do when they love each other from a distance that has become permanent. She had a room above the boarding house kitchen that smelled like boiled cabbage and the landlady's pipe tobacco, and she had a window that faced a brick wall, and she had 6 years of mornings that had been exactly like the morning before. The letter from Gerald Foss was the first thing in 6 years that had felt like a door opening instead of closing. Packed what mattered not much, and she left. Train took her as far as Cheyenne. From Cheyenne, she paid a man with a supply wagon to carry her and her trunk northwest toward the settlement of Hartfield, where the hotel was supposed to be. The ride took 2 days and cost her $4, and left her with mud on everything she owned. When they came around the last curve into Hartfield and she saw the lot where the Caldwell Hotel was supposed to stand, what she found instead was a foundation of scorched stone and a half-collapsed wall, with burn marks still black on the limestone. The wagon driver told her the fire had happened in July. Bad luck with the stovepipe, people said. The whole building went in under 3 hours. She stood there for a long moment. Then she asked him if Gerald Foss was still in town. He wasn't. Nobody knew where he'd gone. She had $27 left, a trunk, and a letter of employment for a job in a building that no longer existed, from a man who had apparently ceased to exist along with it. She spent that first night in Hartfield at a rooming house that cost her $1.50 and smelled nearly as bad as the place she'd come from. She lay on a narrow cot and stared at the ceiling and made herself think, practically, the way she'd always forced herself to think when things went wrong, not about what she felt, but about what could be done. What could be done was limited. She could try to find work in Hartfield itself, but Hartfield was small and looked like it had been small for a long time and planned to stay that way. She had walked the main street twice and counted 3 businesses that seemed to be operating, and 4 that seemed to be figuring out whether they wanted to bother. Take the next wagon back to Cheyenne and try to find domestic work there. But that would cost her another $4 for the ride. And Cheyenne was a city that already had more women than positions. Or she could do what the rooming house owner had mentioned in passing, almost as an afterthought, when she'd asked whether there was anyone nearby who might need household help. There's a ranch about 8 miles out, the woman had said. Iron Bar, Vale's place, widower with a little girl. They had a woman out there last winter, but she married one of the hands and left in the spring. Could be they need someone. Could also be they can't afford anyone. Vale's had 2 hard years running. But if you're desperate enough to ask, it's your best chance within 20 miles. Evelyn had lain on that cot and turned the word desperate over in her mind and decided she didn't care for it. But she also decided it was accurate. In the morning, she paid a boy 50 cents to carry her trunk on his mule as far as the ranch gate. She would walk the rest herself. The boy left her half a mile from the gate when the wind shifted and the temperature dropped so fast. She could feel it happening, could feel the air change quality, thicken with something that had ice in it, turn from merely cold to something with intention. She made herself walk faster. When she finally saw the gate, she saw also that the chain was locked, and there was no one in sight, and the ranch house was far enough from the gate that she would have to shout to be heard, and shouting felt like the wrong approach. So she sat on the trunk, and she waited, and she watched the smoke from the chimney, and she thought about the fact that her feet had stopped hurting, which she knew from years of Wyoming stories told by travelers at the boarding house was not a good sign. She was sitting there, trying to decide whether to call out anyway, when the ranch house door opened. Child came out. Small 7, maybe 8 years old, bundled in a coat, 2 sizes too large, picking her way across the frozen ground with the careful deliberateness of someone who had been told many times not to run near ice. She was carrying a plate. When she got to the gate, she didn't unlock it. She pushed the plate through the gap between the lower bars and looked at Evelyn with large, serious eyes the color of creek water in winter. Cold beef, 2 pieces of cornbread, a sprig of something dried rosemary maybe, or just a weed the child had thought was pretty. Plate was chipped along one edge. Evelyn took it. "Thank you," she said. The child said, "You've been out here a long time." "I have. Are you cold?" "Yes." The child thought about this. "Papa says I can't let anyone in unless he says so. That's a good rule. He's in the barn." The child looked over her shoulder toward a large structure at the far end of the property. "I can go get him. I'd be grateful." The child looked at her for one more moment, that careful measuring look that children sometimes have, that is more honest than anything adults manage. And then she turned and ran back across the yard, her coat flapping. Evelyn ate the cold beef. She ate both pieces of cornbread. Whatever the rosemary was, she left it on the plate because it was, in fact, just a weed. Caleb Vale came out of the barn 15 minutes later. He was not what she'd expected, though she couldn't have said what she'd expected. Taller than she'd pictured, with the kind of lean that comes from working too hard and eating too little rather than from nature. Dark hair, going gray at the temples, which put him somewhere in his late 30s. A face that had been outdoors in bad weather for most of its life. He walked with a slight forward lean, like a man perpetually pushing against wind. He looked at her through the gate bars with an expression that was not unkind, but was not warm either. The expression of someone who had run out of margin for complications. "My daughter says you're looking for work," he said. "I am. We're not in a position to take on help right now." "What position are you in?" He blinked. It was the kind of answer he hadn't prepared for. "Pardon?" "I asked what position you're in. Not because I'm being rude. I want to understand what I'm walking into, if you'll hear me out." He looked at her for a moment. Then he took a breath. "Behind on a banknote. Cattle prices dropped last fall, and I couldn't sell at a rate that made sense, so I'm carrying more animals through a second hard winter than I've got good feed for. I've got 6 hands who've stayed, because I've promised them wages in spring. And I've got a daughter who needs someone in the house, and I can't be in the house and the barn at the same time. That's the position I'm in, and you can't pay. Not right now." "No, what's the house like?" He frowned. "What do you mean?" "Kitchen, the pantry. Is there food?" "There's food enough. Not extravagant." "Who's been cooking?" "And one of the hands. Manny, he's the only one who'll touch a pot without complaining." He paused. "It's not good cooking." She stood up from the trunk. Her knees ached from the cold. "I'll work through the winter for room and board, and we settle wages in spring when you know what you've got. The ranch goes under, I lose nothing more than time, and I've been losing time anyway. If it holds, you owe me what the work was worth." He stared at her. "That's not a reasonable offer," he said. "It's the only offer I've got. You don't know anything about this ranch. I know the kitchen needs someone who knows what they're doing. I know there's a little girl who brought me her supper plate through a gate in the freezing cold because she didn't want me to be hungry. And I know I've got nowhere else to go that makes any better sense." She picked up the end of her trunk. "Are you going to unlock that gate or not?" He stood very still for a moment. The wind came across the flat land and pushed at both of them, and neither of them moved. Then he took a key from his coat pocket and unlocked the chain. Kitchen was worse than he'd let on. Evelyn stood in it the first morning, before anyone else was awake. before the sun was anything more than a gray suggestion behind the hills, and she made herself look at all of it without flinching. That was the first skill, she'd always thought. Not fixing. Looking. Really looking at what was there, instead of what you wished was there. The wood stove needed its flue cleaned. She could tell by the way the smoke backed up when she opened the damper. Not much. Just a little, but enough to mean it was losing efficiency, eating through wood faster than it should. Pantry shelves had been organized by someone who had put things wherever they fit without thinking about what got used daily and what didn't. So the salt and the lard were at the back behind 3 cans of things she couldn't identify, and a rusted hinged box that turned out to hold nothing but old harness buckles. There was a half side of beef hanging in the cold storage that had been cut badly big uneven chunks that would just waste the best parts if someone just hacked off what they needed each day. There were onions going soft in a sack in the corner. There was a crock of dried beans that had been left without a lid and were half full of mouse droppings. Stood in that kitchen, and she cataloged all of it in her head, and then she went to work. She didn't ask Caleb's permission. She didn't announce what she was doing. Just started. The flue first, she'd cleaned 100 of them at the boarding house, and she had the tool for it in her trunk, which might have seemed odd packing for a job at a hotel, but which she'd carried for years because a clean flue was the difference between a kitchen that worked and one that made people miserable. She swept the soot into the ash bucket and wiped the stovepipe, and by the time she had the first fire going, the draught was strong, and the kitchen began, for the first time in what smelled like months, to actually warm up. Then she dealt with the beef. She asked Caleb when he came in at 7 for his coffee where the salt barrel was and whether there was a smokehouse. He showed her both without asking why. She spent 2 hours that morning reprocessing the side of beef into portions that made sense, what could be cured, what should be cooked soon, what could be stretched into broth and soup stock that would feed 6 men better than raw chunks thrown in a pot with water. She found a wheel of cheese behind the flour sack that was only slightly molded and could be saved entirely if trimmed right. She found in the back of the cold storage 3 jars of last summer's tomatoes that someone had put up imperfectly and left there as if hoping they'd improve on their own. 2 of the jars she threw out, one was still good. She used it for the noon meal. When the hands came in at noon and sat down to a table that had hot soup, fresh bread, and a plate of fried cornmeal that wasn't burned for the first time in what Manny, the hand who cooked sometimes, estimated was 6 weeks, they were quiet for a long moment. Then one of them, a raw-boned man named DeWitt who looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts and strong opinions, looked up from his bowl and said, "Who are you?" "Evelyn Hartwell." "You cooking permanent?" "For the winter." He went back to his soup. "Good," he said, which from his face appeared to be the equivalent of a standing ovation. Caleb watched her the way people watch things they're trying to figure out. Not unfriendly, she didn't think he was a man given to cruelty, not to people at least, though she'd known enough men in enough hard situations to know that hard situations sometimes unlocked things in people that easier times kept closed. He was cautious. He was tired in a way that had gotten into his bones. And he was proud in the specific way that men who've been struggling in silence tend to be not arrogant, but armored. Everything he said or didn't say was calculated to project that he had things in hand, that the situation was under control, that he was managing. He was not managing. She could see that in everything. The way the ledger sat open on the desk in the corner of the main room, the columns dense with numbers that never quite added up to something comfortable. The way he sat down to meals and ate without tasting, eyes somewhere else. The way he checked the barn twice at night instead of once, like a man who doesn't fully trust that what he's counting on will still be there when he gets back. She didn't say any of this to him. It wasn't her place, and it wouldn't have been welcome. But she started paying attention to the numbers the way she paid attention to the kitchen, watching where the waste was, watching where things could shift. The first thing she changed that he noticed was the bread. He'd been buying flour from a merchant in Hartfield at a price that, when she asked to see the last 3 receipts out of casual curiosity, dressed up as household accounting, turned out to be 40% higher than the going rate at a mill she'd passed the name of on a sign outside Cheyenne. She mentioned this to him at supper one evening, setting the 3 receipts beside his plate in a line. He looked at them. He looked at her. "How do you know the mill price?" I asked. "Sent a letter last week, a silence. You sent a letter on my behalf without asking me. I sent a letter asking about flour prices. I didn't sign your name to it." Another silence. Longer this time. He picked up the receipts and looked at them with the expression of someone who has suspected something for a long time and is now being shown the confirmation in ink. "The mill's far," he said. "It is. But they deliver bulk orders to Hartfield twice a year, and the next delivery is in February. If we order now, we lock in the lower price, and we don't have to deal with Hendricks at the general store, who's been gouging you since." She stopped. "Sorry. I don't mean it since my wife died," he said flatly. "You can say it. Everyone knows it. I stopped watching the numbers for a while after Agnes died, and Hendricks noticed." He set the receipts down. His jaw was tight. It was a long while. She didn't say anything. Sometimes the best thing you could do was just let something be said without rushing to fill the space around it. Picked up his fork. He didn't look at her. "Write to the mill," he said. "Tell them we want a standing arrangement." Elsie was 7 years old, and she had been alone for 18 months in the specific terrible way that children are alone when they've lost the parent who was their particular point of warmth. Agnes Vale had apparently been the kind of woman who made a house feel inhabited, not just cleaned and organized, but actually alive, the way some people can do just by being in a room. Caleb had told her almost nothing about Agnes, but Evelyn had pieced together a portrait from the small evidence, the embroidered kitchen curtains that someone had kept clean even through the worst of it, the cup on the top shelf blue, with a small crack repaired with what looked like tree sap that no one touched, and that Caleb's eyes went to sometimes when he thought no one was watching, the way Elsie would stop mid-sentence sometimes and go very still, as if she'd heard something no one else could hear. Child was not difficult. She was just careful. She watched before she spoke. She was helpful in the way of children who have learned that being useful keeps them close to the adults they need. She set the table every evening without being asked and carried the plates back after, with the focus someone carrying something irreplaceable. She'd started following Evelyn through the kitchen about a week after Evelyn arrived. Not intrusively, not underfoot, not chattering, just present, sitting on the high stool in the corner with her feet, not quite reaching the lower bar, watching with those gray-green eyes. On the 9th day, Evelyn asked her if she wanted to learn to make biscuits. Elsie's face went through 3 separate expressions in the space of a second surprise, then something complicated that might have been longing, then a careful neutrality, as if she was worried about wanting it too much. "Mama used to make them," she said. "I know. I've seen her recipe card in the tin by the stove." Pause. "You looked at it?" "I looked at everything in the kitchen. I didn't use it wasn't mine to use without asking." "I'm asking now." Elsie was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "You have to use lard, not butter." She said butter makes them too soft. She was right. And you can't work the dough too much, or they get tough. Also right. Something shifted in Elsie's face, a small, careful opening, like a window cracked on a warm day after a long winter. "Okay," she said. She got down from the stool. They made biscuits every morning for the next 2 weeks. Evelyn was not trying to replace Agnes. She understood, in the deep practical way she understood most things, that replacing Agnes was not possible, and that trying would be the fastest way to break whatever was beginning to form between her and this child. She was just present. She showed up every morning at the stove, and she let Elsie stand beside her, and she talked about what her hands were doing instead of talking about feelings, because that was what her own mother had done, back when Evelyn was small, and the kitchen was the only room in a difficult house that felt like safety. She didn't know if it was working. She didn't push to find out. And then, on a Thursday morning in the 3rd week of December, she came into the kitchen to find that Elsie had moved her cup. It was a plain cup white, no markings, one of 3 identical ones she'd found at the back of the shelf the day she arrived. She'd been leaving it on the counter by the stove because the hooks above the stove were taken up with the battered tin mugs the hands used, and she hadn't asked about getting another hook put in because it felt presumptuous. Elsie had moved it to the shelf, specifically to the shelf above the stove where Agnes's blue cup sat. She hadn't put it next to Agnes's cup. She'd left us a space, a deliberate, respectful space. Evelyn's cup was beside the space. Agnes's cup was on the other side, as if the space itself was the third thing, the thing that would always be there between them. Evelyn stood and looked at this arrangement for a long moment. Then she went on making breakfast because Caleb would be in from the barn in 20 minutes and the men needed to eat. But she was aware for the rest of that morning of something that had shifted in her chest, something that had been braced against impact, slowly, carefully lowering its guard. The ranch, she was learning, ran on a particular kind of stubborn faith, not the kind people talked about in church. Caleb never mentioned church, and she never saw evidence of it in the house, but the kind that shows up in a man who keeps going to the barn at 5 in the morning when the temperature is 20 below, and cattle are stressed and the feed is running short and the numbers don't work and the bank letter sits on the desk like a stone. Kind that's less about belief and more about refusing to stop moving. Six Hands had their own version of it. DeWitt with his spare parts frame and his opinion about everything. Manny, the quiet one from Sonora who cooked when forced to, and who Evelyn suspected, was the reason the kitchen existed in any usable form at all. He'd clearly been maintaining things to a minimum standard just to keep people alive. A young hand named Pike who was maybe 20, and who seemed to be in a constant, unspoken argument with the concept of weather. Three others whose names she learned slowly, Hobart, Reed, Cass, who existed in that particular way of men who've worked together long enough that they communicate mostly in shorthand and assumption. She learned their preferences without asking about them. DeWitt took his coffee, black and bitter, and would drink 3 cups before he said a word in the morning. Manny ate everything she put in front of him with the same equanimity, but she noticed he always cleaned his bowl of anything with onions first, suggesting he liked them. Pike didn't eat fat, and she'd caught him quietly pushing it to the edge of his plate, so she started trimming the meat cuts differently, and he ate everything and didn't know she'd noticed. Small things, invisible things, the kind of work that never shows because it's done right. By the end of December, she had cut the ranch's food expenditure by a number she worked out one evening while Caleb was in the barn, $31 a month. When she factored in the waste she'd stopped, the bulk order coming from the mill in February, the preserved meat extending the fresh stock, flour and salt she'd negotiated at better rates through a supplier in Cheyenne that Reed mentioned in passing because his sister lived there and used the same supplier. $31 against a monthly household budget that, from what she could tell from the receipts she'd looked at, had been running at around 90. She didn't tell Caleb this. She worked it out on a piece of paper and folded the paper into the back of her Bible, not because it was private exactly, but because she'd learned, over years of working in houses that didn't belong to her, that men who were struggling with pride didn't always receive help in the shape they needed it. Sometimes you had to let the improvement be visible before you put numbers to it. The numbers would be visible soon enough. She found the potatoes on the 28th of December, which she would remember later as the day things stopped feeling temporary. She'd been sweeping out the space beneath the garden beds, the kitchen garden at the back of the house, which in winter was just frozen dirt and dead stems, and a few boards that had been used for something structural and abandoned, when the broom handle went through a thin crust of frozen soil, and she heard a hollow sound underneath. She got down on her hands and knees in the frozen dirt, and she dug with her fingers until she found the edge of a wooden storage box that had been built into the ground and covered over, the way people sometimes did before the first hard freeze, as emergency storage. Inside the box, wrapped in straw, 40 pounds of potatoes. Maybe more. Old, some of them sprouted, some of them gone soft, but a solid 2/3 of them still good. She sat back on her heels and looked at this find and felt something she hadn't felt in weeks, which was a specific kind of quiet satisfaction that has nothing to do with happiness and everything to do with finding the thing that was going to make the difference. She brought the potatoes inside 2 buckets at a time and spent the next 3 hours sorting them, the bad ones aside for the compost, the good ones into the cold storage, the borderline ones into a pot with salted water to preserve them another week. Then she went to find Caleb. He was in the barn, doing something to a piece of harness that appeared to be resisting his efforts. "Did you know there was a root cellar under the kitchen garden?" she said. He looked up. "Agnes put it in year before she died." He paused. "I forgot it was there. There are 40 pounds of potatoes in it." He was quiet for a moment. He set the harness piece down. He ran one hand back over his hair in a gesture she had started to recognize as his version of being caught off guard. 40 pounds, closer to 45. It'll extend the food stores another 6 weeks at minimum. He was looking past her, at something she couldn't see. "She planted them herself," he said. "She always said we needed a backup." He stopped. His voice had done something at the word backup, and he appeared to be deciding whether to acknowledge it or push through it. He pushed through it. "Good find," he said. He picked up the harness piece again. She went back to the kitchen. That evening after supper, she heard him go into the kitchen garden alone. She didn't look out the window. Some things you let happen without watching. The bank letter arrived on the 3rd of January. She knew it was the bank because Caleb's face went still when he opened it, not the usual stillness of a tired man, but the specific stillness of someone holding a piece of news steady with everything they have. He read it twice. He set it face down on the desk. He didn't say anything at supper. He didn't have to. By the time the hands had finished eating and gone back to the bunkhouse, Evelyn had seen the number cross his face, not literally, but in the way that worry about a specific number has a specific shape, different from general worry, more precise, more pressing. She washed the dishes. She dried them. She put them away. He was still sitting at the desk when she came out of the kitchen. "It's bad news," she said, not a question. He looked up. For a moment, she thought he was going to say something polite and closed, the kind of sentence designed to end the conversation before it started. Then whatever he'd been about to say seemed to get stuck somewhere. "They moved the deadline," he said. "March payment. They want it in January." He paused. 60 days. "I've got 60 days to come up with the payment, or they start proceedings." She stood very still. "How much?" he told her. It was not a small number. She thought about the $31 she'd saved. She thought about the flour coming from the mill in February, thought about the potatoes in the cold storage, and the recut side of beef and the soup stock she'd been building all month from bones and scraps. None of it was enough. She knew that before she finished the thought. "Can you sell cattle?" she said. "At winter prices." His voice was flat. "I'll take a loss. But you can do it. It'll put the herd down below the number I need to rebuild next year." He looked at the letter. "Survive January and lose the future. That's the choice." She didn't say anything, because there was nothing useful to say, and he was smart enough to know that she knew that. She said goodnight and went to her room, which was small and had a window that faced the barn, and a bed that was not comfortable but was hers, and she lay in it and stared at the ceiling, and thought about the fact that if the ranch went under, she would leave with $11 and months of work behind her, and nothing to show for any of it. She thought about this for a long time, and then she thought about Elsie's cup on the shelf, and the potatoes Agnes had planted, and the recipe card in the tin by the stove, and she thought about the fact that she had nowhere better to be, which was not a comfortable reason to stay somewhere, but might, in the end, be enough. Outside, the wind had come up. She could hear it finding the gaps in the walls. This house had gaps. She knew every one of them now and pressing in, the way Wyoming winter pressed in on everything, patient and indifferent and entirely without mercy. Pulled the blanket up and closed her eyes. In the morning, there would be breakfast to make, and biscuits, and a day's work that didn't care about bank deadlines, or lost futures, or the particular cold that came from sleeping in someone else's house and not knowing if it would still be there in 60 days. She would make breakfast. That was enough to start with. The morning after Caleb told her about the bank letter, Evelyn was up before 4. Not because she couldn't sleep, she'd slept. A hard, dreamless sleep that dropped her down and released her before the sky had made up its mind about anything. She was up because she'd thought of something in that last half minute between sleep and waking, the way solutions sometimes arrive when the thinking part of your brain has finally stopped interfering. She lay there for a moment, holding the idea still, checking it from different angles, the way you'd check a board for rot before putting weight on it. Then she got up, dressed in the dark, and went to the kitchen. Pantry was where she went first. She'd been cataloging it in her head since the day she arrived, the way she used to catalog the boarding house stores back in Philadelphia, building a running inventory that she never wrote down, because writing it down took time she didn't have. She knew what was there. She needed to know what it was worth, not in dollars, in days. She stood in front of the shelves with a candle, and she counted everything in terms of how long it could feed 8 people, 6 hands Caleb, herself at full rations, at reduced rations, kind of reduced rations that kept men working without making them mutinous about it. Counted the flour situation twice, because flour was the foundation of everything. Counted the salt pork, the dried beans, the preserved tomatoes, the cornmeal, the last of the oats. She went to the cold storage and counted the beef and the potatoes and the wheel of cheese she'd saved. She notes set in her head, arranging them in columns that only she could see. When she was done, she stood in the middle of the cold storage room and she did the arithmetic. 60 days. That was what Caleb had. 60 days to come up with the bank payment or the proceedings started. She had already saved the ranch $31 a month in household expenses. That was real money, not theoretical. Not projected, but actual dollars that had not been spent because she'd stopped the waste and found the better prices. Over 2 months, that was $62. It wasn't the bank payment, but it wasn't nothing. The question was what else there was to find. She went back to the kitchen, built up the fire, and started the coffee. She got out a sheet of paper from the drawer where Caleb kept his ranch records. She'd asked permission for this on her third day, and he'd said yes with a brevity that suggested he'd already stopped thinking of the supplies as entirely separate from her, and she wrote down what she knew and what she suspected and what she needed to confirm. She was still writing when Caleb came in at 5:30. He stopped in the doorway when he saw the paper. He looked at it, then at her. He poured himself coffee and sat down across from her without saying anything, which she had come to understand was his way of indicating willingness to listen. "I've been looking at the pantry numbers," she said. "I gathered we're carrying more overhead than we need to. Not in wages. I know you've already cut what you can there. In the supply costs." She turned the paper toward him. She'd written 3 columns, what they were currently spending, what they could be spending, and the difference. "Hendricks has been selling you salt at nearly double the price I can get from a trading post in Casper that does mail orders. I found the catalog in your desk. It was already there. You just weren't using it." He looked at the columns. His jaw tightened slightly, the way it did when he was absorbing something he didn't like but couldn't dispute. "The trading post takes 3 weeks for delivery. We have enough salt to last 6, so we order now." She tapped the paper. "But that's not the main thing. The main thing is the cattle." He looked up. "Not selling more than you planned," she said quickly. "I know you've already worked out the minimum sale to make the payment. I'm not suggesting you go below the herd." She paused. "But there are 2 steers in the south pasture that DeWitt mentioned are eating at twice the rate of the others and not putting on weight the way they should. He said it 3 weeks ago. I heard him say it to Manny. Animals like that are a liability in a winter this hard. If you sell them now, even at the reduced price, you cut your feed costs for the rest of the winter and put some cash against the payment." Caleb was quiet. "I'm not telling you anything about your cattle that you don't already know," she said. "I just think sometimes when you're watching everything at once, it's hard to see the individual pieces." He drank his coffee. He set the cup down, and he looked at the paper, and he looked at her, and he said, "How long have you been thinking about this?" "Since November." Something moved across his face that she couldn't quite name. It wasn't exactly gratitude. It was more complex than that. The expression of a man who has been carrying a weight alone for long enough that having someone else acknowledge its existence is both a relief and, strangely, a little bit humiliating. "I'll look at those 2 steers today," he said. She nodded and got up to start the biscuits. He didn't thank her. She didn't need him to. The paper stayed on the table all through breakfast, and when the men filed out afterward, she noticed Caleb folded it into his coat pocket. She went on with her morning. The biscuits came out right, not perfect, because biscuit perfection was a mood-dependent thing that even experienced hands couldn't guarantee every time. But right. Good enough that Pike, who usually ate in silence, said these are better than yesterday's as he was leaving, which from Pike was roughly equivalent to a formal citation of excellence. Elsie appeared at 7:30, her hair still half undone from the braid she'd slept in, rubbing one eye with the heel of her hand. She climbed onto her stool in the corner and accepted the biscuit. Evelyn handed her without comment. They were quiet together in the way that had become comfortable over the past weeks. Evelyn washed the breakfast dishes. Elsie ate her biscuit and watched. This was their particular morning, the men gone. Caleb in the barn, the house settling into the quiet that it kept only for these 2. "Papa was up late last night," Elsie said. "I know. He was looking at papers. He's got a lot to figure out right now." Elsie picked a crumb off her biscuit with one finger. "Is the ranch going to be all right?" Evelyn turned to look at her. The child was watching her with those serious eyes that saw more than a 7-year-old should have to see. There was no point in a pretty answer. Elsie was not a child who was comforted by pretty answers. She was a child who had already had the worst thing happen, and she knew the difference between reassurance and truth. "I don't know yet," Evelyn said. "But your father is working on it, and so am I. And between the 2 of us, we've got a better shot than most." She paused. "That's the honest answer." Elsie considered this. "Mama used to say that worrying about something doesn't change it. It just makes you tired. Your mama was right. She also said that doing something about it is better than worrying." Elsie looked at her. "You're doing something about it." "Trying to." "That's the same as doing," Elsie said, with the flat certainty of a child who has not yet learned to hedge their certainties. She finished her biscuit. "Can we make soup today?" "We can make soup today." The business with the meat preservation was something Evelyn had been wanting to attempt since the first week, but had held back on because she hadn't wanted to push too many changes at once. Men in hard circumstances were suspicious of change on principle Not because they were stupid, but because in hard circumstances, the familiar had kept them alive, and the unfamiliar had a history of making things worse. Spent December doing the obvious things. The flu, pantry reorganization, the bulk flour order, the salt situation. Things that improved life in ways the men could feel without necessarily being able to name. The food was better, the kitchen was warmer, the supplies were lasting longer. No one had asked her to explain herself, and she hadn't offered. January was different. In January, she needed to go further. The issue was the beef. They had the side she'd reprocessed in November, which was lasting well. But there was another side, a smaller one, from a steer Caleb had slaughtered at the end of December that was going to push the limits of the cold storage by February if they didn't do something with it. The temperature had been below freezing every day since she arrived, which helped, but cold storage in a Wyoming winter was not the same as a controlled cellar. She'd seen enough borderline meat in her years of kitchen work to know the signs of something that was thinking about turning. She needed to cure it. The problem was the salt supply, which was limited until the Casper order arrived, and the smokehouse, which she'd looked at once and not gone back to because it needed work. She found Manny in the bunkhouse one afternoon, mending a pair of gloves with the focused patience of a man who'd learned a long time ago to take care of his own things. "The smokehouse," she said. "What's wrong with it?" He looked up. He had a face that gave almost nothing away, but she'd learned to read the small adjustments, the slight narrowing of the eyes that meant he was interested, the way he set down whatever he was holding when a conversation had his full attention. He set down the gloves. "The door hinge broke last spring," he said. "Caleb was going to fix it, and then the spring went bad and it didn't get fixed." "Is that the only problem?" Manny thought about this. "The firebox needs some new clay around the edges." "But that's not hard. Could you fix both?" He looked at her for a moment. "Probably." "Why?" "Because if the smokehouse is working, we can cure the second side of beef instead of hoping the cold storage holds another 6 weeks. We can also cure some of the salt pork more effectively than what we've been doing and extend it another month." She paused. "That means less money spent on fresh meat in February." Manny was quiet for a moment. He picked up his gloves again, then set them down again. "I can fix the hinge today," he said. "The clay needs to dry before you can use the firebox. Take 2 days if the weather holds." "The weather's not going to hold." "No," he agreed. "But I can make it work anyway." He did. He fixed the hinge that afternoon in the kind of cold that makes metal treacherous and tools slip, coming back inside twice to warm his hands before going back out. He packed the clay around the firebox edges with the methodical care of a man who understood that a job done wrong in January was a job done over in February, which was worse. He said nothing about why he was doing it, and she said nothing about it either. And when DeWitt asked him at supper what he'd been at all afternoon, Manny said smokehouse, and DeWitt said about time, and that was the extent of the conversation. The smokehouse was operational by the 15th of January. Evelyn cured the second side of beef over the next 4 days, using a combination of salt, the dried rosemary, that was actually, she had verified, just rosemary and not a weed, and a technique her mother's cousin had shown her once that she'd thought about occasionally over the years and never had occasion to use. The result was not beautiful. It hung in the smokehouse like something that had been through an argument with itself, but it was preserved. And it would last another 8 weeks. And 8 weeks of beef was 8 weeks of the ranch's money, staying in Caleb's pocket instead of Hendrix's. She told Caleb about it at supper that evening, briefly, between the soup and the bread, the way she reported most of the supply changes, factually, without drama, as if it were simply a matter of stating what had occurred. He looked at her. Then he looked at the table. Then he said, "That's going to be a problem for Hendrix." "Is that a concern?" "Hendrix runs a tab system with most of the ranches around here. You start sourcing around him, he can make things difficult. He can make things difficult regardless," Evelyn said. "Question is whether the money you're saving is worth the difficulty." Caleb was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "When did you get hard-headed about business?" "I've always been hard-headed about business," she said. "I was just being polite about it." Something shifted at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. She wasn't sure she'd ever seen a complete smile from Caleb Vale, but the possibility of one, briefly visible. He ate his soup. The conversation moved on. But that night, doing the last of the dishes, she found herself thinking about that almost smile, and what it meant that she'd noticed it, carefully as she'd noticed everything else in this house. And she decided that was a thing she was not going to examine too closely for the moment. There was too much else to pay attention to, and the examination could wait, probably indefinitely. She finished the dishes. She went to bed. She was asleep in 4 minutes. The hands were starting to talk about her. Not unkindly, she knew what unkind ranch hand conversation sounded like, had heard enough of it at the boarding house from men passing through. And this wasn't that. This was the other kind, the quieter kind, which was in some ways harder to navigate because it was not hostile and therefore harder to keep at a distance. She overheard DeWitt telling Reed one afternoon that in 20 years of ranch work he'd never eaten as well in winter, which was followed by Reed saying something she couldn't quite catch, followed by DeWitt saying, "I know that. I'm not saying anything. I'm just saying the soup is good," which told her there was a conversation happening that she was being carefully excluded from, which was appropriate, and she intended to keep it that way. Pike was the most obvious. He was 20, which explained most of it. He'd started finding reasons to be near the kitchen, at times that had nothing to do with meals, which she addressed by giving him tasks. Whenever he appeared splitting kindling, carrying water, hauling the ash bucket, and he did them without complaint, which suggested he hadn't entirely thought through what proximity to the kitchen was going to mean in practical terms. She was not interested in any of it. This was not coyness, and it was not modesty. She was 34 years old, and she had spent 17 years working in other people's houses, and she had made a specific, considered decision some years back that her value was not going to be measured in terms of whether someone wanted to marry her. She had enough to manage without adding that particular arithmetic to the column. What was harder to manage was Caleb himself, not because he did anything obvious he didn't. He was, if anything, more careful than he'd been at the beginning. He kept his distance with the specific precision of a man who is aware that distance is required and is maintaining it consciously. He spoke to her about ranch matters and household matters, and occasionally about Elsie and about nothing else, and when she answered, he listened with the full, serious attention he gave to everything and then moved on. But he was also always there when something needed doing. She dropped a pot of hot water in the kitchen. One morning slipped on a patch of wet floor, caught herself on the counter. The pot went over and the water went everywhere, and she'd said a word she didn't usually say out loud. And by the time she'd gotten the mop from the closet, Caleb was in the doorway with the other mop, the one from the barn, which was not exactly a kitchen mop, but was functional enough, mopping the far end of the spill without comment. She'd looked at him. He'd looked at her. "I was coming in for coffee," he said. "Coffee's on the stove. I can see that." They mopped the kitchen floor in silence. He poured his own coffee afterward, which he never did. She usually had it ready and went back to the barn. She stood in the kitchen with the mop and looked at the clean floor and thought about nothing in particular for about 30 seconds. Then she went back to work. The improvement in Caleb's numbers became visible to him in the 3rd week of January, when he sat down with his ledger on a Sunday evening and did the accounting for the month so far. She wasn't in the room, she was in the kitchen, doing the last preparations for the next day's breakfast, which was a thing she did on Sunday evenings, because Monday mornings were always more complicated than other mornings. Some quality of Mondays that made the wood stove temperamental and the coffee grounds clump, but she heard him go still in a particular way. Scratch of the pen stopped. The pages stopped turning. Then she heard him push his chair back and come to the kitchen doorway. "Evelyn." She turned. He was standing in the doorway with the ledger open in his hands, and he had the expression she'd been waiting for, without letting herself expect it. Because expectation was a way of setting yourself up for something that hadn't happened yet, and she'd learned better. The expression of a man who has seen a number he didn't think he was going to see. "The household accounts," he said, "for January." "Yes." He looked at the ledger. He looked at her. "You've saved me." He stopped. "Weeks between November and now, you have reduced the household expenditure by..." He stopped again. "This isn't the mill order. This isn't just the bulk pricing. The total $162, she said. "When you factor in the extended beef supply from the smokehouse, which I calculated at current market value for the equivalent quantity." She turned back to the stove. "It's an estimate. I might be off by a few dollars in either direction." Silence. She could feel him standing in the doorway. Kitchen was warm. It was always warm now. The clean flue pulling steadily, and the silence had a quality to it that she was trying not to pay too much attention to. "That's not nothing," he said. "No, that's..." He stopped for the 3rd time. She heard him close the ledger. "I owe you an apology." She turned around. He was looking at her with an expression that had something raw in it, something that had pushed through the armor. "When you arrived," he said, "I told you I couldn't pay you, and you said you had nowhere else to go, and I let that be enough. I let myself believe that because I didn't have the money, the debt somehow didn't exist. He paused. That wasn't right. She looked at him for a moment. No, she said. It wasn't. He absorbed that. In spring. In spring we settle, she said, if there is a spring on this ranch. There isn't, she shrugged. We deal with that when it comes. The bank payment is 60% accounted for, between the cattle sale and what I've saved. She said it plainly, without drama. Because drama didn't help anything. I don't know where the other 40% comes from. 60% is better than nothing, and nothing is what you had 6 weeks ago. He stood there for a long moment. You know what you're doing, he said. It wasn't really a statement or a question. It was more like something he was saying out loud that he'd been thinking for a while and had finally decided deserved to be said. Most of the time, she said. Not always. She turned back to the stove. Go do your accounts. I need to get the bread started for tomorrow. He went. She heard the pen start up again in the next room, and she stood at the counter and let herself, briefly, feel the shape of what she'd built here over the past 2 months. Not a victory, nothing was settled yet, and the bank deadline was still coming, and winter was nowhere near done. But something, a structure, a thing that had not been here before she came through that gate, started the bread. February arrived with a cold that was different in character from January's cold, less dramatic, more patient, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself with blizzards and howling wind, but simply pressed in from every direction, a steady, grinding chill that wore at everything over days. The cattle were struggling. Caleb didn't say this directly, but she could read it in the way he came in from the barn, the set of his shoulders different, depending on what he'd found, the length of time he spent outdoors before coming in, the quality of his silence over meals. The herd was smaller now, he'd sold the steers. Including the 2 DeWitt had flagged, and the number was down to 310. 310 animals, all of them needing feed and warmth and attention through what was shaping up to be the worst February anyone could remember. She did what she could with what she had. She started making the ranch hands meals, more substantial, not more expensive, just more thought out, the kind of food that keeps men warm for longer, that gives them fuel for the cold work. More fat, more dense carbohydrates, more hot liquid. She made sure the coffee was always on, and that there was something to eat at midday, even when there wasn't a formal noon meal, which meant maintaining a pot of something soup, usually, or beans with salt pork that men could come in from the cold and eat from without ceremony. DeWitt ate 3 bowls of soup on a Wednesday in the second week of February, and then sat at the kitchen table for a moment, with his hands wrapped around his cup and said, You know what I keep thinking about? What? How different this place is from 6 weeks ago. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at his cup, not just the food, the whole place. The stove draws better, she said. It's not the stove. He looked up. He stopped. He's got something to work toward now. That's what I mean. He pushed back from the table. Soup's good, he added, which closed the conversation and went back out into the cold. She stood in the kitchen and thought about what DeWitt had said. She thought about whether it was true, and then thought about whether it mattered if it was, and then decided that both questions were ones she didn't have answers to yet, and the bread wasn't going to make itself. The mill flour arrived on the 17th of February. Not on a scheduled delivery run. The weather had pushed the Casper supply wagon back twice, and she'd stopped expecting it to any particular schedule, but on a Tuesday afternoon, when the sky was that specific flat gray that meant it was thinking about doing something unpleasant later, and had not yet decided what. Reed came in from the road and said there was a wagon at the gate, and Evelyn went out, and there it was. 200 pounds of flour, packed in double canvas to protect it from moisture, at the price she'd negotiated in November. Caleb came out of the barn when he heard the wagon. He stood beside her while they unloaded it. That's the mill order, he said. That's the mill order. He looked at the bags. He looked at the price tag she'd tied to the first bag when she'd confirmed the order, her habit, keeping records of what things should cost so you could verify against what you were charged. He did the math in his head the way she'd noticed he always did, quick and accurate. You got it for that, he said. I got it for that. He was quiet for a moment. Hendricks is going to hear about this. Hendricks has probably already heard about the smokehouse and the salt order from Casper. She helped Reed carry the first bag inside. I imagine Hendricks is not my greatest admirer right now. He's not mine either, but that's been true for 2 years. Then there's nothing to lose. She heard something behind her as she carried the flour through the door. She wasn't sure, without turning around, whether it was Caleb laughing or just breathing in the cold air. She didn't turn around to check, but there was a lightness to his step when he came back inside that she hadn't heard before. A slightly different quality to the way he moved through the house. She found herself aware of it in a way that had nothing to do with the ranch's accounts, or the flour on the pantry shelves, or anything practical at all. She shelved the flour. She went back for the next bag, kept her thoughts practical and her attention on the work. This was the thing about winter. It kept you busy enough that there wasn't much room for anything else. Cold and dark and constant work had a way of narrowing everything to what was in front of you, what needed doing, what could wait, and what couldn't. She'd always found that clarifying in the boarding house years. Not comfortable, never comfortable, but clear. What was in front of her right now was 200 pounds of flour, a cold storage full of cured beef, a smokehouse that worked, and a ranch that was still standing 60 days after she'd walked through the gate. 62 days, she calculated. 62 days, and the bank deadline was in 4. Elsie got a fever the week before the bank payment was due. Not a bad fever, not the kind that made adults go quiet with worry, which Evelyn had seen enough of to recognize immediately. Just the ordinary kind that children got in cold weather, when they'd been running in and out of warm spaces too many times, and their bodies finally registered the complaint. But it put Elsie in bed, and Elsie in bed meant someone needed to be in the house, and someone in the house was Evelyn. She didn't mind. She sat beside the child's bed with the mending, which was a task that could be done anywhere, and she told Elsie stories while she worked, not fairy tales, which Elsie had announced at age 6 were boring. Kind of practical stories that Evelyn had grown up on. Stories about real things and real people making real decisions in real difficulty. Her grandmother, who had run a farmstead alone for 3 years when her husband was sick. A woman from the boarding house who had arrived with nothing and left with a small business that she'd built from the savings of 4 years of careful work. Elsie listened with her eyes half closed, the fever heat making her quieter than usual, the quilt pulled up to her chin. Did they always figure it out? Elsie asked, about the woman from the boarding house. Not always. Sometimes things didn't work the way they were supposed to. What did they do then? They figured out what to do next. Evelyn set down the shirt she was mending and looked at the child. That's the whole of it, really. You don't have to have everything figured out. You just have to figure out the next thing. Elsie considered this. What's the next thing for us? For the ranch? Your father's working on it. And you? I'm sitting here mending your father's shirts and making sure you drink the broth I left on the side table. She pointed to the cup. Drink the broth. Elsie drank the broth with the expression of someone submitting to something under protest. Caleb came in to check on her 3 times that evening, each time with the particular awkwardness of a man who wanted to do something helpful and was limited by the fact that everything helpful was already being done. The 3rd time, he stood in the doorway of Elsie's room and looked at the 2 of them, his daughter half asleep under the quilt, Evelyn in the chair beside her with the mending, and he stayed there for a moment longer than checking in required. Evelyn looked up. He met her eyes, something passed in them that had no name, and that she immediately declined to examine. She looked back down at the mending. She's fine, she said. Fever's dropping. She should be up by Thursday. He said goodnight to Elsie, who was already most of the way asleep. He left the doorway. She heard him go to the main room, heard the scratch of his pen starting up again. Outside, the wind had gone quiet for the first time in 3 days. The house was warm. The lamp cast its particular orange light across the quilt and the chair and the mending in her lap. And for a moment, just a moment, Evelyn let herself sit inside the feeling of being somewhere instead of somewhere. She caught herself at it. She folded the shirt, set it aside, picked up the next. Elsie slept, the pen scratched in the next room. And the ranch, battered and reduced and still standing, held its ground against the February dark, the way it had held it every night since she'd arrived. And the night before that, and the night before that, all the way back through the long, hard winter to whatever had come before she was here to see it. Elsie's fever broke on a Wednesday, exactly as Evelyn had predicted. The child came into the kitchen that morning, moving carefully, the way people move when they've been horizontal for 3 days, and are testing whether vertical is going to hold, and she climbed onto her stool and sat there watching Evelyn at the stove with the particular quiet of someone who has been sick long enough to be grateful for ordinary things. You were right, Elsie said. About what Thursday? She paused. It's Wednesday. Close enough. Elsie accepted this with the gravity of a small judge. She ate the soft eggs Evelyn put in front of her without complaint, which was the clearest sign she was recovering. Elsie had opinions about eggs when she was well, and suspended them when she wasn't. The bank payment was due in 3 days. Evelyn knew this the way she knew everything in the house, not from being told, but from watching. She'd seen Caleb at the desk every evening that week, the ledger open. The columns tallied and retallied as if the numbers might improve with repetition. She'd seen the envelope he'd addressed to the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne, sitting on the corner of the desk, weighted down with the small iron horse that Elsie used as a paperweight, and had apparently placed there herself without being asked, the way children sometimes make gestures that are more precise than anything an adult would think to do. She didn't ask Caleb what the final number was. She already knew, in the approximate way she'd known most things about this ranch finances since the first week, not from the ledger directly, but from reading the shape of his worry, the specific weight it carried, the way it pressed on him differently than the general worry of running a struggling cattle operation. The bank payment would wipe out nearly everything he had left. The herd was smaller. The cash reserves were not reserves anymore. They were a number barely large enough to be called a number. Iron Bar Ranch would survive January. It would survive by the thinnest possible margin, and what would be left on the other side of survival was going to be very lean indeed. She thought about this while she did the breakfast dishes, thought about it while she made the noon meal, and while she reorganized the pantry for the third time, because reorganizing the pantry was what she did when she needed to think, without appearing to think. She counted the supplies. She counted the days to spring, counted the ways the ranch could rebuild from a herd of 280 animals. If the spring market was reasonable, and the summer grass came in well, and nothing else went wrong, which was always the variable you couldn't account for, the thing that made all the arithmetic provisional. She was in the middle of this quiet calculation when Caleb came in from town. She knew something was different before he spoke. It was in the way he came through the door, not the usual cold stiffened, barn-smelling entrance of a man who'd been working, but something more deliberate. He was carrying something. A small package, brown paper, string-tied, which he set on the table without explanation. He poured coffee. He sat down. He looked at the package. "I went to see Harlan Bell at the bank," he said. Harlan Bell was the branch manager. She'd heard the name twice, both times in the same tone people use for a tooth that's been giving them trouble. "And payment accepted." "We're current," he said it flatly, without the relief she might have expected. "Through March." "Through March," she repeated, "not beyond." "No," he turned the coffee cup in his hands. He made a point of being very clear that the grace period we were given, moving the deadline from March to January, was the full extent of the bank's patience, and that if the spring payment isn't made on time, they proceed. He paused. He was polite about it. Harlan Bell is always polite. That's what makes him so unpleasant. She sat down across from him. "What's in the package?" He looked at it. "I stopped at the dry goods after the bank. Bolt of blue fabric Agnes used to make Elsie's dresses." Thought he stopped. "I don't know why I bought it." It seemed like shook his head. "It doesn't matter." She looked at the package. She thought about the blue cup on the shelf. She thought about the dress Elsie had been wearing for the past 2 months that was about an inch too short in the hem, because children grew whether the ranch was struggling or not. "I can make a dress," she said. He looked up. "I'm not a seamstress," she said quickly, "but I can make a straight dress for a 7-year-old. I'd need to take measurements." He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded once, and pushed back from the table, and took his coffee to the window, and stood there looking out at the yard, at the barn, at the flat white expanse of land that stretched to the hills. She left the package on the table and went back to the kitchen. That evening, after Elsie was in bed, she opened the package and measured the fabric and began cutting. The scissors were Caleb's. She'd found them in the desk drawer, the same drawer where the catalogs were, heavy iron scissors that needed sharpening, but would do. She sat at the kitchen table and cut and pinned and thought about nothing in particular, which was a skill she developed that over years of work that required hands and not necessarily mind. And the house was quiet around her, and the stove was warm, and outside the wind had gone to wherever wind goes when Wyoming finally pauses for breath. She was nearly finished with the cutting when she heard Caleb come into the kitchen doorway. She didn't look up. "I know it's late. I'll clean this up before breakfast." "I wasn't going to say that." He came in and sat down at the far end of the table on the opposite side of the spread fabric. He had a glass of water, which meant he'd been awake long enough to be past coffee. "How long have you been sewing?" "Not long. My mother taught me." Not properly, she wasn't trained for it either, but functional. Quiet for a moment. "Elsie hasn't had a new dress since August. I noticed. I kept meaning to—" He stopped. "There's always something else to mean to do." "There is." She made a cut with the scissors, careful along the seam line she'd drawn in chalk. "That's not a criticism. I know." He turned the water glass in his hands. You're very careful not to criticize. She looked up at that. He met her eyes, and there was something in his expression that was halfway between observation and question. I'm an employee, she said, working for room and board until you have money. Criticism isn't my place. You criticized Hendrix's prices the first week. That's different. That was business. So is everything you do here, he said it evenly. You run this household like a business. Every decision, every purchase, the smokehouse, the flour, the way you handled the beef. That's not a complaint, he added, before she could respond. I mean it as a fact. You have better instincts for this ranch than anyone I've worked with. She set the scissors down. She wasn't sure what to do with that, exactly. So she looked at the fabric and thought about where to put the hem. The ranch is salvageable, she said. That's what the instincts are telling me, if you're asking. The spring market holds and you rebuild the herd strategically, not trying to get back to 400 at once, but building the breeding stock first and letting the numbers come up over 2 seasons. You can be in a position by the fall of next year that looks very different from where you are now. He was looking at her. That's what I see, she said. I'm not an expert in cattle. You're an expert in resources, he said. Cattle are a resource. He paused. What I'm trying to say is, you don't need to say anything, she said, not unkindly. We're square for now. The bank is paid. The ranch is standing. Let's get through March before we have any more conversations about the future. He held her gaze for one more moment. Then he nodded and took his water glass and said goodnight, and she listened to his footsteps go down the hall to his room. She sat at the kitchen table with the blue fabric and the chalk-marked pieces, and she let herself, for exactly 30 seconds, acknowledge that something in this house had shifted in a way that had nothing to do with flour prices or smokehouse repairs. Then she picked up the scissors and went back to the hem, because 30 seconds was enough and there was still work to do. Finished the dress on Saturday. Elsie put it on in the kitchen, standing on the step stool so Evelyn could check the hem, and she looked down at the blue fabric with an expression Evelyn had not seen on her face before, not happiness, exactly, but something more complicated. The expression of a child who has been given something that costs more than the giver is admitting. It's blue, Elsie said. It is, like she stopped. I know, Evelyn said. She didn't say what she knew. She just kept checking the hem. After a moment, Elsie said, it's the right blue. Good. Caleb saw it at breakfast. He stopped in the kitchen doorway, his morning habit, checking that the stove was going and the coffee was on before he said anything to anyone, and his eyes went to Elsie sitting at her stool in the blue dress, and he was still for a moment in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Then he said, that's a good-looking dress, Elsie. Elsie looked down at it. Evelyn made it. I know. He looked at Evelyn. Thank you, he said. Just that. Not elaborate. But he said it like he meant it fully, and it cost him something, which was how she'd come to understand. Caleb Vale said all the things that mattered. She handed him his coffee. The morning went on. March arrived, and the weather did not improve in the way that March in Wyoming is sometimes merciful enough to improve, where there's a thaw and a promise of things coming. This March stayed hard, the ground stayed frozen. Cattle were thin, and the feed was running lower than Caleb had projected in his most pessimistic estimate, which was itself a number that had made him go quiet for a full evening when he'd calculated it in February. Evelyn watched the feed situation the way she'd been watching everything practically, without panic, which was not the same as without concern. She asked Manny about it one afternoon when they were both in the barn. For different reasons, she was looking for a particular tool she needed for the smokehouse, and he was patching a water line that had cracked. How bad? She said. He thought about how much to say, which was his way. He always thought about it first, which she respected, because it meant when he said something, it was actually what he thought. 3 weeks of current use, he said. Maybe 4 if we reduce. What does reducing mean for the cattle? They lose weight. Spring market goes down. She thought about this. What if we supplemented with something? There must be something nearby. Ransom spread about 4 miles east. He wintered well-right herd size for his feed, but he wouldn't sell. Manny paused. He and Vale don't talk. Why not? The pause longer this time, something from 4 years ago, before Agnes died. Water rights, they had words. She stood with the tool she'd found and thought about that. Would Ransom sell to me? Manny looked at her. I've never had words with him, she said. He was quiet for a long moment. Probably, he said finally. Ransom's practical. Most people are, when you approach them practically. She turned the tool over in her hand. What does he charge for hay? Manny. told her. She did the math in her head against the feed budget she'd been maintaining in the column she kept in the back of her Bible. It was tight. It was very tight. But it was possible if she pulled from the household contingency she'd been building from the supply savings. She went to see Ransom the next morning. She rode one of the ranch horses she could ride, barely, which was something she'd neglected to mention to Caleb because barely seemed sufficient for her purposes, and more than that was not something she'd had occasion to learn in Philadelphia. Horse was a steady gray animal named Compass that Manny had recommended for not having opinions about direction, which turned out to be accurate. The Ransom spread was smaller than Iron Bar, and better organized, the kind of ranch that had never been grand, but had never been desperate either, kept in good order by someone who didn't swing between ambition and catastrophe. A man came out of the barn when she rode up, middle-aged, heavy-set, with a beard that had gone fully gray, and a face that had no hostility in it, but no particular welcome either. "You're Vale's housekeeper," he said. "I'm Evelyn Hartwell. I manage the household at Iron Bar. I heard about you." He looked at the horse. Compass hasn't been off the property in 2 months. He was glad for the outing, she said, which was probably not true, but was the kind of thing that gave a conversation somewhere to go. Ransom's mouth moved slightly. "What do you need?" "Hey, whatever you can spare. I can pay current rate." Cash, she named the price Manny had told her. "If you've got more than you'll use before spring grass, you're leaving money standing in your barn." He looked at her for a long moment. "Vale know you're here?" "No, why not?" "'Cause I thought it would go better if it was a business conversation and not a personal one." Quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I've got 20 bales I won't need." "I'll take 15. "Why not all 20? "'Cause taking all of them leaves you nothing if the spring is late, and I need you to be in business next winter too." She met his eyes. Ransom's hay at a fair price is worth more to the valley than one desperate purchase that cleans you out. He looked at her for what felt like a full minute. "I'll have them at your gate by Friday," he said. She paid him from the contingency fund, which left the fund at a number that made her stomach tighten slightly, but the tightening was manageable. She rode Compass back across the flat land in the cold March air and told herself she would tell Caleb about it at dinner and deal with whatever his reaction was, because the hay was coming, whether he approved of the method or not. His reaction at dinner was silence, a long, specific silence that she recognized as the kind that was processing rather than angry. Then he Ransom agreed. "He had surplus. It was practical for both of us. He and I know you had words 4 years ago." She served herself the soup. "He doesn't have words with me." Another silence. "Then what did you pay?" She told him. He absorbed the number. "That's out of the household fund," he said. "Yes, you didn't ask me." She set her spoon down. This was the moment she'd known it was coming, had been thinking about how to handle it since she'd ridden back from Ransom's that morning. Not with apology, because she wasn't sorry for what she'd done, but with honesty. "No," she said. "I didn't, because I thought if I came to you and said Ransom has hay and I want to buy it, you would have said no before you'd finished hearing the sentence, and we'd have 3 fewer weeks of feed for your cattle, for a reason that has nothing to do with the cattle." She paused. "I was wrong to go without telling you. I'm not wrong about the hay." He looked at her. The lamp between them threw his face into sharp relief, the deep-set eyes, the jaw that was always slightly clenched, the lines around his mouth that were from weather and worry in roughly equal measure. "You're a complicated woman," he said, not angry. Almost something else. "I've been told," she said, and picked up her spoon. He ate his soup. DeWitt, who had been eating at the far end of the table through all of this, with the focused attention of a man pretending very hard to be somewhere else, caught Manny's eye across the table. Manny looked at his bowl. DeWitt looked at his. Nothing was said. The hay arrived Friday. It was in the 3rd week of March, on a day when the sky had finally begun to make promises about spring that seemed at least partially credible, that Margot Bell came to Iron Bar Ranch. Evelyn was in the kitchen when she heard the wagon on the road, and she was at the back of the house, checking on something in the cold storage, when the knock came at the front door. So it was Elsie who let Margot Bell in, and it was Elsie who came to find Evelyn with the formal precision of a child, playing at being a proper hostess. "There's a lady," Elsie said. "She says she knows you." Evelyn did not know Margot Bell, or rather she knew of her. The name had come up twice in Hartfield, in the way names come up in small towns when they belong to someone who occupies significant space. Margot Bell had owned the original Caldwell Hotel, the one that had burned in July, and had apparently rebuilt it in the fall, with a speed and thoroughness that people described with a mixture of admiration and slight wariness, The way people talk about someone who has more energy than seems quite natural. She was younger than Evelyn had expected, mid-30s. Probably, with the kind of manner that had been deliberately constructed to seem effortless, the composed voice and easy smile of a woman who had learned that appearing capable was sometimes more useful than being capable. Though from what Evelyn had heard, Margot Bell was also genuinely capable, which made the manner doubly effective. She was sitting at the main room table with her coat still on, which suggested she did not intend to stay long, which suggested the visit was purposeful rather than social. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "I'm Margot Bell. I know who you are." Evelyn sat down across from her. "Can I get you coffee?" "No, thank you. I'll be brief." She folded her hands on the table, well-kept hands, the hands of someone who directed work rather than doing it, which was not a criticism but an observation. "I heard about you in November, when you came through Hartfield looking for work. I was occupied with the hotel rebuild at the time, and I couldn't offer anything. I've been watching the situation here," she paused, with interest. "Watching how?" "Hartfield is a small town. Reed's sister lives there. Manny goes in for supplies. People talk." She said this without apology. "I know what you've done here. I know about the flour and the smokehouse and Ransom's hay." Her eyes were direct and assessing. "You turned a failing operation around in 3 months." "The operation hasn't turned around yet," Evelyn said. "Bank payment is made. The winter isn't over." "Close enough." Margot leaned forward slightly. "I'm rebuilding the hotel. I need someone to run it. Not the front, I handle the front. The back. The kitchen. The stores. The staff. The numbers." She paused. $12 a month. Private room, and I'll advance the first month's wages on the day you start, so you're not depending on a spring settlement that may or may not happen. Kitchen was quiet. From somewhere outside came the sound of one of the hands dealing with something that required a hammer, a rhythmic banging that had been going on all morning and had become background noise the way all persistent sounds eventually did. Evelyn sat with the offer and felt its weight. $12 a month was what Gerald Foss had offered in November, the offer that had brought her 900 miles and deposited her at a burned hotel lot with $27 and a letter that was useless. $12 a month was more than she'd ever earned. $12 a month was a private room, and a wage that was real and paid on time by someone who appeared to be neither unreliable nor combustible. An iron bar had not paid her anything, would not pay her anything until spring. If spring brought what Caleb hoped for, which was itself a series of ifs stacked on top of each other, if the herd held, if the market was fair, if nothing else broke. She was 34 years old. She had $11 in the lining of her boot, the same $11 she'd arrived with. She had spent 3 months building something that did not belong to her, and the strongest argument she had for staying was a child's cup on a shelf and a feeling she had specifically decided not to examine. Those were not practical arguments. "I'd need to give notice," she said. "Of course. A week is sufficient. I'd need to leave things in order here." Naturally, Evelyn looked at her hands on the table. They were not hands like Margot's, they were a working woman's hands, dry from the cold and the kitchen work, the knuckles slightly reddened. She had a callus on her right palm from the heavy pot handles. She had a small scar on the back of her left hand from a knife slip in November that she'd cleaned and wrapped herself without telling anyone. These hands had built something here, something that had not existed before she came through that gate. "I'll think about it," she said. Margot Bell nodded. She reached into her coat pocket and placed a card on the table, a proper printed card, the kind you got made in Cheyenne, the hotel name and her name in the town. "Take your time," she said. "I can wait a week." She stood. "But I do need an answer, Miss Hartwell. I'm not in the habit of leaving positions open indefinitely." She left without seeing Caleb, which might have been deliberate or might have been coincidence. The wagon sounds faded down the road toward Hartfield. Evelyn sat at the table and looked at the card. Then she got up and went back to the kitchen because the noon meal didn't make itself. She did not tell Caleb about the visit that day. She told herself this was because there was nothing to tell, yet she hadn't decided anything, and reporting an offer she might not accept seemed premature. She also knew, in the honest part of herself, she tried not to hide things from, that this was partially true and partially not. She thought about it through the noon meal, and through the afternoon, and through the supper preparations, the way you think about something when you're trying to think about it from the outside, rather than the inside trying to see it as it was, rather than as you wanted it to be. Practical case for leaving was clear. $12. Her own room. A wage that was paid and not theoretical. An employer who had not spent 3 months accepting her labor without compensation. Practical case for staying was also clear, if smaller. She had knowledge of this ranch now that had values. She knew its numbers, its weaknesses, its seasonal patterns. She'd invested 3 months in building systems that would fall apart without someone maintaining them. The flour arrangement, the Casper salt order, the smokehouse protocol, these were not things Caleb or Manny could manage with the same attention, not while running the cattle operation through a difficult spring. And beneath the practical cases, she was honest enough to acknowledge, was something that was not practical at all, which was precisely why she was trying very hard not to let it influence a practical decision. She went to her room that night and sat on the bed and looked at the window that faced the barn and thought about what she was worth to herself, which was the question she'd been asking herself since she was old enough to understand that it was a question. In Philadelphia, she'd been worth $6 a month and a room that smelled like cabbage. She'd made herself worth more than that in practice. Anyone who'd relied on her kitchen knew it, but the official number had been $6, and $6 was what had been on the ledger. Here the ledger had nothing. 11 weeks of empty. That was the part she kept coming back to. Not the offer. Not Margot Bell's composure, or the $12, or the private room. The ledger. The fact that 11 weeks of her best work had been received, used, and not recorded as having any value. She understood why it had happened. She'd offered to work for room and board, and she'd meant it at the time, and the meaning had been genuine. But there was a difference between an arrangement made from necessity and an arrangement that was allowed to continue past the point of necessity, and she'd been watching that line get crossed week by week, and she hadn't said anything, and Caleb hadn't said anything, and now it was March, and the line was a long way behind them. She was not angry. That was not what she felt, exactly. What she felt was something more uncomfortable than anger, which was the specific variety of sadness that comes from discovering that someone sees you differently than you had begun to hope. She sat with that for a while. Then she made her decision. She left before dawn. Not because she was hiding, she left a note, long and carefully written, the longest thing she'd written in years, explaining where everything was and what needed attention in the coming weeks. Flour arrangement and the Casper order schedule and the feed situation and the cold storage status and the specific things about each of the hands that she'd learned over 3 months that had no place in a supply ledger but mattered for running the household. She wrote all of it down, clearly, practically, without sentiment. She left food. She left the pantry stocked for 2 weeks. She left the stove built up and burning steadily and the coffee ready to be put on. She left Elsie's blue dress hanging on the hook by the kitchen doorway, which was where she'd last seen Elsie put it after wearing it. Stood looking at it for a moment, and then not looking at it, and then she picked up her trunk. It was still the same battered trunk, heavier now than it had been when she arrived by the accumulated weight of winter, and she carried it to the road. The morning was dark and cold and very still, the kind of Wyoming stillness that comes just before the light changes and everything shifts. She walked the 8 miles to Hartfield with her trunk, stopping twice to rest, and once to reposition something inside it that had shifted and was pressing on the latch. Her feet remembered the road from the other direction. November going out, March coming in, and she thought about that briefly, and then put it away. She knocked on Margot Bell's door at 8 in the morning. Margot opened it, looked at the trunk, looked at Evelyn's face, and stepped aside. "Coffee," she said. "Please," said Evelyn. She started at the hotel the next morning. The noon meal at Iron Bar Ranch that day was not made. She was not there to make it. Manny put together something from the cold storage, cold beef, bread from yesterday, coffee that was adequate, but not right. Coffee having been something that Evelyn had managed, with a specific attention to heat and timing that Manny could not quite reproduce. The men ate without comment, which was its own kind of comment. Pike kept glancing at the kitchen doorway. DeWitt ate his bread with the expression of a man sitting through something he had opinions about. It was Caleb who found the note. He'd come in at 11 and seen it on the table, and he'd read it standing there with his coat still on and his hat still on, not sitting down. The way you read something you want to be able to fold back up and put in a pocket because you're not ready for what it's telling you to be something that happened at a table. He read it twice. He set it down. He sat down. He was sitting there when the men came in for the noon meal. He was still sitting there when they finished and went back out. Manny put a plate near him, and he didn't touch it. Elsie came home from the neighboring woman's house, where she'd been spending mornings, an arrangement Evelyn had made in January, to give the child some company her own age, and came into the kitchen and stopped. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the cold stove, and the note on the table, and the hook by the doorway where the blue dress was not, because Elsie had it on. Then she went to the desk in the main room and opened the bottom drawer where the old ranch records were kept. The ledgers from years back, the accounts from before Agnes died, pulled out the wage ledger from the current year. It was the ledger Caleb used to record what each hand was paid, week by week, their names in the left column and the amounts in the right. She opened it to the first page for the season. The hands' names were there. The amounts were there. And there, below the last hand's name, in handwriting that was not Caleb's and was not Manny's, in pencil that had been pressed carefully and neatly into the page, was Evelyn's name, written once for each week, going back to the third week of November. 11 entries, 11 weeks. The amount column beside each one was empty. Elsie put the ledger on the table in front of her father and stood beside it and waited. Caleb looked at it for a long time. He looked at the entries, the careful penciled letters, the weeks marching down the page, the spaces beside each one where a number should have been and wasn't. Put his hand flat on the page. Outside, the wind had come up, the first real wind in days, moving across the flat land the way it always did, with that specific Wyoming indifference to everything in its path. That the house moved slightly against it, the way it always did, the small sounds of boards and joints settling. Caleb sat with his hand on the page and his daughter standing beside him, and the empty amount column running down 11 lines of someone else's careful handwriting, and he understood, for the first time in the full way, that understanding sometimes requires being hit with the thing directly, what he had allowed to happen. What he had let himself not see, because not seeing it had been easier than what seeing it required. He closed the ledger, he stood up. He went to find DeWitt. DeWitt listened to the whole thing without interrupting, which was not his natural inclination, but which he managed by the specific effort of a man who understands that some conversations require it. Caleb told him about the note. He told him about the ledger. He told him about Margot Bell, which he'd only just put together the wagon tracks from yesterday morning leading toward Hartfield. The timing, the fact that Evelyn had made the decision overnight and been gone before anyone was up. He told DeWitt all of it, standing in the barn doorway with the cold coming in from behind him and the ledger in his hand, and when he was done he said, "I need you to go to Hartfield." DeWitt said, "You need all of us to go." Caleb looked at him. "I'm not being dramatic," DeWitt said. "I'm being practical. You show up alone. It looks like a personal thing. You show up with 6 men who all ate her cooking for 11 weeks. It looks like what it is." He pulled his coat off the hook. "Give me 10 minutes to get the others." It took 12 minutes because Pike's horse needed a quick reshow on the left front that Manny insisted on doing before they rode anywhere, and Manny was right about the shoe, but the insistence cost them time that none of them had the patience for. They rode out at 1:30, 6 men and Caleb, which was the entire working population of Iron Bar Ranch minus Elsie, who had been left with the neighbor woman again, with instructions that she was not to worry, and that her father would be back before dark. Elsie had handed Caleb the ledger when he was leaving. He looked at it. "I have it," he said. "Take it anyway," she said. She said it the way she said everything careful, certain the specific gravity of a child, who doesn't waste words on things she doesn't mean. She should see it. He took it. The road to Hartfield was 8 miles of flat land and frozen mud, and a wind that had opinions about all of it. They rode without much conversation, which was not unusual for men who worked together every day, and had exhausted most of the available conversational territory months ago, but the silence had a different quality than it usually did. There was something purposeful in it, directed. Reed rode up beside Caleb about halfway and said, "You know she might not come back." "I know, you're going anyway." "Yes." Reed thought about this for a moment. "What are you going to say?" "I don't know yet. Might be good to know before you get there." "Might be," Caleb agreed. "I'll figure it out." Reed dropped back. Caleb rode the rest of the way thinking about what he was going to say, and by the time Hartfield came into view across the flat land he had worked out several versions of it, none of which felt entirely right. And so he set them all aside and decided to say what was true, which was usually the only thing that worked anyway, and was harder than all the prepared versions combined. Bell Hotel was on the main street, which in Hartfield meant it was visible from essentially everywhere in town simultaneously. It was newer than everything around it. The rebuild had given it a fresh face that stood out against the weathered boards of its neighbors. Not aggressively grand, but clearly looked after, kind of building that had been planned by someone who thought past the immediate necessity. They found Evelyn at the side of the building. She was sitting on an upturned crate peeling potatoes. There was a large bowl at her feet, already half full, and a bucket of unpeeled potatoes beside her, and she was working with the steady, automatic efficiency of someone who has peeled enough potatoes in enough years that her hands knew the job without her needing to supervise them. She was wearing her work dress, the gray one, not the better brown one she kept for occasions that hadn't arisen since she'd arrived in Wyoming, and her hair was done practically the way it always was in the kitchen. And she looked, in every visible way, like a woman who had settled into a new situation and was getting on with it. She looked up when she heard the horses. She saw 6 men and Caleb, and the ledger under Caleb's arm, and she set down the potato and the peeling knife very carefully on the edge of the crate, and she waited. Caleb dismounted. The others stayed on their horses, which he was grateful for because it was the right instinct. They were there as witness and wait, not as participants, and they understood the difference. He walked to where she was sitting, and he stopped about 4 feet away, and he stood there for a moment looking at her. She looked back at him with an expression he couldn't fully read, which was not unusual. Evelyn Hartwell had always been better at reading him than he was at reading her, and he'd known that since the second week and had never entirely adjusted to it. Put the ledger on top of the potato bucket. He opened it to the right page, the page with 11 weeks of entries and 11 empty spaces in the amount column. Turned it so she could read it. She looked at it. She looked at the handwriting, which was not his. Elsie, she said. It wasn't a question. Since the 3rd week of November, he said. Every week. She put your name in, because she said it wasn't right that you weren't in the book. Evelyn looked at the ledger for a long moment. Her jaw had tightened slightly. Her hands, resting on her knees now, were still. She's 7 years old, she said. She understood something that He stopped. He made himself continue. I let myself believe that because the money wasn't there. The debt wasn't there either. That's not the same thing, and I knew it wasn't the same thing, and I let myself not think about it, because thinking about it required something I wasn't ready to do. He paused. That's the honest accounting of it. No excuse attached. She was quiet. I owe you 11 weeks, he said. $9 a week is the going rate for a housekeeper of your quality, and I know it's lower than that, because there's no housekeeper in Wyoming territory who does what you've been doing for this ranch. But $9 is what I can document with comparable positions, and so that's the number I'm using. He reached into his coat and took out the money. He'd counted it at the desk before he left, counted it twice, organized it into a specific order he'd thought about on the ride, and he held it out to her. $99. 11 weeks at $9 a week. She looked at the money. She didn't take it. That's everything you have, she said. It's everything I have in cash. It's not everything the ranch has. Caleb, it belongs to you, he said. It belonged to you in November. I'm $9 short on that, because the first week I wasn't sure what rate to set, and I should have been. So I set it at 9 and paid you the full 11 weeks at that rate. He kept his hand out. Take it or don't. It's yours either way. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind moved between them, carrying that specific March quality that was colder than it had any right to be this late in the season. Then she took the money. She counted it. All of it, bill by bill, with the focused attention she gave to everything, not because she didn't trust him, but because counting was how she verified reality, had always been how she verified it. Caleb watched her count and didn't say anything and waited. She finished counting. She held the bills in her hand and looked at them. $99, she said. Yes, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, you still don't have the spring payment. No. The herd is at $280. You need the spring market to hold and you need... I know what I need, he said. I know what the numbers are. I was making those numbers before you arrived, and I'll be making them after. He paused. That's not what I came to talk about. She looked up from the money. He said, I came because I owe you what's in your hand, and you were gone before I could give it to you. That's the first thing. He stopped. The second thing is harder. She waited. The second thing, he said, and his voice had changed slightly, the way it changed when he was saying something that cost him. Specific flattening that happened when Caleb Vale was working hard to say a true thing without making it larger than it was, is that I can't promise the ranch survives. I can work the numbers, and I can sell smart, and I can do everything right, and the spring market might still go wrong. Can't promise you a future on Iron Bar that is secure or permanent. I can't make promises about what isn't certain. I know that, she said, but I can promise you this. He met her eyes and held them. If you come back, you will never again work a week on that ranch without a wage recorded in that ledger and paid when it's due. I don't care what the bank says or what the market does. Your name will be in the book and the column will not be empty. He paused. That's the promise I can actually keep. So that's the one I'm making. Street was quiet around them. From inside the hotel, there was the sound of someone moving furniture, a scraping and thumping that was the background noise of a place still being assembled. One of the horses behind Caleb shifted its weight and blew out a breath that came visible in the cold air. Evelyn looked at the money in her hand. She looked at the ledger on top of the potato bucket. She looked at Caleb. "You rode 8 miles in this cold," she said. 8 miles is not that far. You brought all 6 of them." He glanced back. DeWitt met his eyes and looked immediately at the middle distance, which was DeWitt's version of minding his own business. DeWitt said it would look like what it was, Caleb said. He was right. Something shifted in Evelyn's face. Not quite a smile. She was not a woman who smiled easily, any more than he was a man who did but the thing that existed in the territory just before a smile, the thawing of an expression that had been held very carefully in place. "What is it?" she said. "What does it look like?" He looked at her directly. "Like a man who made a mistake and is standing in the cold trying to correct it." He paused, surrounded by people who think it matters. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she picked up the peeling knife and set it in the bowl and stood up from the crate. "Give me a few minutes," she said. "I need to speak with Margot Bell." She was inside the hotel for 11 minutes. Caleb counted them, not deliberately. Just the way you count things when you're standing somewhere cold, trying not to look like you're waiting when you're obviously waiting. DeWitt behind him said nothing. None of them said anything. Pike's horse moved again, and Manny said something quiet to it in Spanish, and it stilled. When Evelyn came back out, she was carrying her trunk. Caleb moved to take it from her, but she shifted it slightly, not refusing exactly, more the automatic response of someone who has been carrying her own things for a long time. And then she stopped and looked at him and let him take the other end. They carried it together to where his horse was tied. She said she expected it. Evelyn dusted her hands. She also said she's still going to need someone for the hotel, and if things change, I should come back and talk to her. "And you said?" "I said I'd keep it in mind." She looked at him. "Don't read into that, I wasn't." She gave him a look that indicated she was aware he had been slightly, and that she was choosing to let it go. He tied the trunk behind his saddle. She didn't have a horse, which he'd somehow not fully thought through on the way out, the practical problem of getting her and the trunk back 8 miles, and he'd brought Compass as the second horse, Manny riding double with Reed for the journey out. So she took Compass, and Manny rode behind Reed on the way back, which Reed complained about, and Manny accepted with the equanimity he applied to everything. They rode out of Hartfield at a little past 2 in the afternoon. About a mile out, Evelyn rode up alongside Caleb. They were quiet for a stretch, the horses moving at an easy pace on the frozen road. Then she said, "The spring payment. The spring payment is my problem. I know it's your problem. I'm thinking about it anyway." She looked at the road ahead, the Ransom hay purchase. "You have a relationship there now, even if it's technically my relationship. Ransom's practical. If you went to him directly, acknowledge the water rights situation from 4 years ago." "I'd have to apologize," he said. "Yes." He was quiet. "He's got good land on that eastern boundary," she said. "Better grass than yours on that side. If he was agreeable, a grazing arrangement for the summer would let you rest your own south pasture and rebuild the grass coverage, which means better carrying capacity next winter." She paused. "That's not a spring payment solution, but it's a long-term position that's stronger." He rode for a moment. "You've been thinking about this ranch's grazing patterns." "I've been thinking about this ranch's everything since November." "You know that." He did know that. He'd known it for months, the way you know something that you're not quite ready to say you know. "I'll go see Ransom," he said. "You should bring something." "Not money. He doesn't need money from you. Something that acknowledges the thing from 4 years ago without making a ceremony of it." "What would you suggest?" She thought about it. "He's got 2 daughters. Does he?" 3. "Any of them need something the ranch can provide." Caleb was quiet for a moment. His oldest was asking about a bull for her husband's starter herd, last I heard. "Year ago. That might still be the situation." "Can you spare a young bull?" "Barely. Barely is enough." He looked at her. She was watching the road ahead with the same expression she used for supply ledgers and pantry inventories, focused and direct, and already 3 steps past the problem she was analyzing. "You're going to do this whether you're employed at the ranch or not," he said. Came out less like an observation and more like something he'd just understood. She glanced at him. "I'm going back to the ranch because your offer was fair, and because there's work that needs doing, and because—" She stopped. "Because there are reasons that aren't about the work that I have decided to count as valid." She looked back at the road. So yes, I'm going to think about the ranch, because the ranch matters to me. That's the situation. He didn't push past that. It was more than she usually gave him directly, and he recognized it as such. They rode the rest of the way without discussing the ranch. Elsie was waiting at the gate. She should have been at the neighbor's house still. Caleb had said before dark, and it was not yet before dark, but it was closer to dark than the neighbor woman had apparently been comfortable with, because there was Elsie at the gate in her coat and her blue dress visible beneath it, standing with her hands gripped on the iron bars, the way she'd stood the first time Evelyn had seen her, looking through from the inside rather than the outside. When she saw the riders, she went still. Then she saw Evelyn on compass, and she did something she almost never did, which was run. She ran across the yard with her coat flapping, and by the time Evelyn had dismounted, Elsie had covered the distance and stopped herself about 2 feet away, with visible effort, catching herself from something that she was too old to do and not old enough to stop wanting to do. Evelyn crouched down. Elsie looked at her. Her face was doing everything at once: relief, and something more complicated than relief. The specific complexity of a child who has spent a day being scared of something she couldn't say out loud. "You came back," Elsie said. "I came back. Because of the money?" Evelyn looked at her for a moment. "Partly," she said. "Not only." Elsie's eyes went to the blue dress visible beneath Evelyn's coat, her own dress, the one she was wearing. "I put your cup back on the shelf," Elsie said, "this morning. When I thought—" She stopped. "I put it back where it was." Evelyn was quiet. "It belongs there," Elsie said. Evelyn reached out and straightened the collar of Elsie's coat, which had been caught wrong. She stood up. "Have you eaten?" Elsie shook her head. "Then let's go make supper." She took the child's hand, and they walked toward the house, and behind them Caleb watched them go from the gate and then began unsaddling the horses without being asked, because there was work to do, and some things did not require being said. Kitchen that evening was not a quiet kitchen. 6 men who had ridden 16 miles round trip in March cold and come back successful had opinions about supper, and those opinions were expressed freely. DeWitt requested the soup from Tuesday, which was not possible, because the soup from Tuesday was gone and had been gone since Wednesday, but he made his preference known as a matter of record. Pike offered to carry water without being given the task, which was unprecedented, and which Manny noted with a raised eyebrow directed at no one in particular. Reed told a story about the ride back that was slightly longer than it needed to be, and featured himself in a more prominent role than the events had strictly warranted. Evelyn made biscuits and fried the last of the good salt pork and boiled the potatoes she'd partially peeled at the hotel into something with the dried rosemary and the end of the cheese from the cold storage. And it was not her best meal, but it was hot and it was plentiful, and the men ate it with the focused appreciation of people who have spent a day doing something on behalf of someone and are satisfied with the outcome. After supper, when the hands had gone to the bunkhouse and Elsie had been put to bed, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with the $99 in front of her. She'd been thinking about it since Hartfield. The money was hers. Caleb had been clear about that, clearer than she'd expected, and she believed him. But $99 in hand versus the spring payment situation, versus what the ranch needed to get through to summer, was an arithmetic she'd been running in the background all evening. Caleb came into the kitchen for the coffee she'd left on the stove for him, the way she'd started doing in January, when she noticed he always came back at 9. He saw the money on the table. He poured his coffee. He sat down. "Don't," he said. She looked at him. "Whatever you're thinking about doing with it." He said it evenly, without heat. "Don't. It's yours. It's not a loan to the ranch, and it's not a gesture, and it's not an investment. It's wages. Wages are yours to spend on yourself or save or use however you decide, not to put back into a ranch that still might not survive the spring." "I know what wages are," she said. "Then why is it still on the table?" She looked at it. "Because I've been thinking about whether to put it in the bank in Hartfield under my name, which is the sensible thing, or to keep it on me, which is what I've been doing since Philadelphia, because I don't entirely trust that what's in a bank is as reliably mine as what's in my boot." Quiet for a moment. "That's a reasonable concern." "I know it is." She picked up the bills and folded them and thought about the boot lining, which had held $11 for 4 months without complaint. The bank might be more dignified. The boot is proven. She looked at him. He was looking at his coffee with the expression that was not quite a smile, but was the thing that lived nearby. The money in her pocket for now. Decision pending. She stood up and began clearing the last of the supper things, and Caleb sat with his coffee and the ledger he'd brought in from his coat, and they were quiet together in the kitchen, the way they'd gotten good at. over months of being in the same room without making a production of it. After a while, he said, without looking up from the ledger, the ransom situation. I've been thinking about what you said, the grazing arrangement. He turned a page. If I approached him about the summer grazing in exchange for the young bull, and he agreed, it changes the feed calculations for next winter significantly. Does. It also means I've got to go talk to Ransom, which I've been not doing for 4 years. Yes. And apologize for the water rights business, which I was not entirely wrong about. You can be not entirely wrong and still have handled it poorly. He looked up. That's a fine distinction. It's an important one. She stacked the bowls. You can hold both. You were right about the water rights, and you were hard about the way you said it. And both those things are true at some time. He sat with that. Agnes used to say something like that. She stopped. Not those words, he said. He was looking at the ledger again. But the idea of it, that a man can be right about a fact and wrong, about how he carries it. He turned another page. She was usually saying it about me. She sounds like she was perceptive, Evelyn said. She was better at people than I am. He said it simply, without self-pity, just as a fact he'd known for a long time and had made peace with the way you make peace with facts. Most people are. I'm better at numbers. Numbers are useful. Not as useful as people. He closed the ledger. I'm going to see Ransom on Friday. I'd like you to. I'd like it if you wrote down what you think the fair terms of the grazing arrangement look like. So I have something to negotiate from, all right. And the bull to bring. There's a 3-year-old in the South herd that's strong, but we've got more breeding capacity than we need right now. I'd like your opinion on whether that's the right one to offer. I'd need to look at him. Tomorrow morning. All right. Stood up. He took his ledger and his coffee cup, and he said good night, and she said good night, and he went down the hall. She stood in the kitchen by herself for a moment. She thought about the $99 in her pocket. She thought about Elsie running across the yard. She thought about Margot Bell's expression when she'd gone back inside to say she wouldn't be staying not surprised. That was the thing. Not surprised at all. Just the small nod of a woman who had anticipated the outcome and made peace with it before it happened. She thought about what Margot had said as she was leaving. The thing she'd said almost as an afterthought. I've run a business in this territory for 6 years. Miss Hartwell. And I've learned to spot the women who are building something permanent and the women who are passing through. You've been building since November. That's not something you walk away from over $12. She hadn't answered that. She'd said goodbye and picked up her trunk. But she thought about it now, in the kitchen of Iron Bar Ranch, with the stove she'd cleaned, and the shelf with the 3 cups, and the pantry that ran the way she'd arranged it. Building something permanent. She'd never owned anything permanent. She'd always been in someone else's kitchen, someone else's house, making something of someone else's materials. She'd been very good at it, and goodness at it had been its own reward. And she'd thought, for years, that she was all right with that. She wasn't all right with it. She'd known that in Philadelphia and not admitted it. You didn't leave a city of 1 million people for a burned hotel in Wyoming because you were all right with where you were. Turned off the lamp and went to her room. Outside, the Wyoming night was clear for the first time in weeks cold, but clear, the kind of clear that meant tomorrow might actually be the day. Winter started to mean it when it pretended to consider spring. Stars over the flat land were very bright. She stood at her window and looked at the barn and the dark and the stars, and thought about what it meant that she had come back, and what it would mean to stay, and whether those two things were the same thing yet, or were still in the process of becoming the same thing. She didn't have an answer. She wasn't sure she needed one yet. She got into bed. She was asleep in the way that comes from a long day, and a resolved decision, and a kitchen that was clean, and a house that was standing, and if it was not peaceful in the way that simple things are peaceful, it was the better kind, the complicated piece of something that had been worked for, and was still being worked for, and was worth the working. Caleb went to see Ransom on a Friday as he'd said he would. He brought the 3-year-old bull, which Evelyn had inspected Tuesday morning and confirmed was the right one, strong-shouldered, good temperament, from the bloodline that had produced the ranch's best animals in the last 2 years. He brought Evelyn's notes on the grazing arrangement, written in her clear hand on 2 pages from the ledger, with the terms laid out and the rationale explained, and a note at the bottom that said these are opening positions, not final ones. Caleb had read twice and then folded into his coat pocket. Came back 4 hours later with a handshake agreement for summer grazing on the eastern boundary and a standing invitation to discuss a water-sharing arrangement on the creek that ran between the 2 properties, which had been the original source of the conflict 4 years ago and which apparently Ransom had also been dissatisfied with but hadn't known how to approach. He told Evelyn this at supper. He told it plainly without making more of it than it was. She nodded. She said, "Good." She passed the bread to DeWitt. DeWitt, who had heard the whole exchange, looked at his bread and said nothing, which was, for DeWitt, the equivalent of a long and eloquent speech. That night, Caleb sat at the desk with the spring numbers laid out, and he ran them forward through the summer, with the eastern grazing factored in. And the number he arrived at was not comfortable, but it was a number that a man could work with. A number that had room for error without being destroyed by it. A number that looked, if not quite like safety, then at least like ground that might hold. He wrote the spring payment figure on a separate piece of paper and put it in the ledger beside the page, with 11 penciled entries. Then he wrote Evelyn's name at the top of a clean page and put $9 beside the current week's entry, in ink this time, not pencil, and the column did not look empty. He left the ledger open on the desk, so it would be the first thing he saw in the morning. It was not a sentimental gesture. He was not, by nature or habit, a sentimental man. Practical reminder of a standard he had set for himself in a cold street in Hartfield on a March afternoon when a woman had counted $99 in front of him, and the counting had been, he understood now, the most honest thing anyone had done for him in years. The ranch was still standing. The spring payment was still ahead. But some things had already been settled that no bank deadline could unsettle, and he knew it, and he let himself know it, and he closed the ledger and went to bed. Spring came to Wyoming the way it always did, not as an arrival but as a slow negotiation between the cold that had been there for months and the warmth that was trying to establish itself, each one gaining and losing ground by turns until finally, sometime in late April, the warmth stopped giving back what it had taken and the negotiation was over. The ground thawed in patches first. The south-facing slope below the barn went soft a full 2 weeks before the north side of the yard, which stayed iron-hard until the middle of April, and then surrendered all at once, turning to mud overnight in the way that always surprised people who hadn't lived through enough Wyoming springs to expect it. The cattle moved differently on soft ground, tentative at first, then with increasing confidence as the grass began to show, thin and pale initially, then greening up by the day into something the animals could actually use. Evelyn watched all of this from the kitchen window, and from the garden, and from the road when she walked it on Sunday afternoons, which she'd started doing in March as a way of thinking without being in the house. She watched the land come back, and she counted things: grass coverage, fence condition, the number of animals she could see from the road on any given pass, and she ran the numbers forward in her head the way she always ran numbers, building the summer picture from the available evidence. Picture was not comfortable, but it was workable. That was the word she kept coming back to. Workable. The spring market opened in the third week of April. Caleb rode to Cheyenne for the cattle exchange 3 days, which was the longest he'd been away from the ranch since Evelyn had arrived, and which required a series of practical arrangements that she and Manny worked out between them without much discussion, because they'd been working alongside each other long enough to know how the other thought. Manny handled the barn and the herd. She handled the house and the accounts. DeWitt supervised the hands with the authority of a man who had been doing it informally for 2 years and appreciated the temporary official status. Elsie asked every morning when her father was coming back. Every morning, Evelyn said, when he's done. And every morning Elsie accepted this with the patient dissatisfaction of someone who knows they're not going to get a better answer. Came back on the 4th day, a day earlier than expected, riding in at dusk with the specific exhaustion of a man who has been in a city for 3 days and found it more tiring than any amount of physical work. He came into the kitchen before he even took off his coat, and he sat down at the table, and Evelyn put coffee in front of him and waited. He wrapped both hands around the cup. He looked at it for a moment. $51 a head, he said. She did the math. Spring herd he'd taken to market had been 40 animals, the ones he'd identified as sellable without compromising the breeding stock or the summer numbers. 40 animals at $61 was $2,440. The spring bank payment was $1,800. She sat down. That leaves $640, she said. $640. He looked up. The first time in 3 years I've made a payment and had anything left. She thought about what $640 meant against the ranch's situation, against the outstanding debt to the bank, the operating costs for summer, the wages owed to the hands, the supply purchases she'd already scheduled. She ran it forward through the summer and the fall, And she came out the other side of the arithmetic with a number that was not large, but was real. A foundation number. The kind of number you could build from. The ransom grazing arrangement, she said. Starts May 1st. He drank his coffee. He was at the exchange. We talked. He's a reasonable man. He was always a reasonable man. I just stopped. You were right about the water rights, she said. And hard about how you said it. He looked at her. You told me that in March. I'm reminding you that Ransom knows it, too. And he came to the exchange and he talked to you, which means he's made his peace with it. She paused. Let him. He was quiet for a moment. Then he nodded. He finished his coffee and he went to find Elsie, who was in her room pretending to be asleep, and was very obviously not asleep. And Evelyn heard the murmur of their voices through the wall, his low, steady, hers higher, and then the sound of something that might have been laughing, or might have been crying, or might have been both. And she went back to the bread she'd been in the middle of when he rode in. Because the bread didn't care about bank payments or Simsprangos markets, and would turn to something unusable if she ignored it much longer. The spring bank payment was made on the 1st of May. Harlan Bells received it at the First Territorial Bank of Cheyenne with the professional pleasantness of a man who preferred to receive payments rather than begin proceedings, and was genuinely, if carefully, relieved to be in the former situation rather than the latter. Stamped the ledger. He shook Caleb's hand. He said something polished about the improvement in Iron Bar's account, standing that was true, and also somewhat beside the point, and Caleb said thank you and took the stamped receipt and left. He rode back in a different state than he'd ridden in. Something had shifted in him that Evelyn noticed when he came into the kitchen that evening and set the receipt on the table, not the collapsed relief of someone who has escaped something, but the straighter posture of someone who has come through something and is still standing on the other side of it. She picked up the receipt. She read it. She set it down. Now we build, she said. He looked at her. You have thoughts about how? I always have thoughts about how I know. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Tell me. She sat down with her paper, the one she kept updated, the running document that lived in her Bible and had been getting longer since November, and she told him. She told him about the summer pasture rotation she'd been thinking through, the way the eastern grazing arrangement with Ransom could be combined with resting the south pasture to improve next winter's feed capacity significantly. Told him about the breeding program for fall, which animals to keep, which to sell, what the numbers looked like if the fall market held at spring levels, which it often did if the summer was good. She told him about the supply arrangements she'd been maintaining, and the ones she thought could be improved, and the mill relationship in Casper that was now solid enough to negotiate a longer-term pricing arrangement that would reduce the flour cost further over the next 2 years. He listened to all of it with his full attention, which was the only kind of attention he had. He asked 3 questions, all of them good ones. She answered them, and he thought about the answers, and he said, All right, which part? All of it. He folded his hands on the table. I've been running this ranch for 8 years. 7 of those years I was running it with Agnes, and 1 of them I was running it alone, and the alone year was the worst year of my life in every possible way. He paused. What you're describing, the way you're looking at this ranch, that's not a housekeeper's view. She met his eyes and held them. No, she said, it's not. They sat with that for a moment. I'm not good at this, he said, not apologizing. Just stating a fact with the same directness he brought to all facts. Saying things. Agnes was she made it easier because she always knew what I meant before I finished saying it. I don't have that, he stopped. I don't assume you. Caleb, she said, he stopped. Say the thing, she said. He looked at her. He said, I don't want you to be the woman who runs this ranch's kitchen. I want you to be the woman who runs this ranch. He paused. With me as my wife if you're willing. Not as an arrangement or a practical solution. I know what practical solutions look like. This isn't that. Kitchen was quiet. The stove made its small sounds. Outside the spring evening was settling into the specific blue that Wyoming evenings got in May, that deep, clear color that happened when the sky was finally clean after a winter's worth of gray. Evelyn sat set with what he'd said. She thought about Philadelphia and the room that smelled like cabbage and the 6 years of mornings that had been exactly like the morning before. She thought about the letter from Gerald Foss and the burned hotel lot and the frozen road and the gate that had been chained shut. She thought about $11 in a boot lining and a child pushing a plate of cold beef through iron bars because she didn't want someone she didn't know to be hungry. She thought about what it meant that all of that had led here. Not smoothly, nothing about any of it had been smooth. Not safely. There was nothing safe about a ranch with a recent bank payment and a spring that had only just started, and a herd at 280 that needed 2 good seasons to be what it should be. But workable. There was that word again. "I'm not Agnes," she said. "I know that. I'm not going to be Agnes. I'm difficult, Caleb. I don't ask permission before I buy hay from your neighbor. I rearrange things and make decisions, and sometimes I'm going to be wrong, and when I'm wrong I'll say so, but I'm going to make the decision first. I know that too, and I'm going to be in the ledger. Properly. Every week you already are." She looked at him. He looked at her. There was nothing performed about it, no speech, no flourish. Just two people sitting at a kitchen table at the end of a long winter, looking at each other with the specific clarity that comes when you've seen someone in hard circumstances and difficult moments and unguarded minutes, and you know who they actually are rather than who they present themselves to be. "Yes," she said. He didn't make a production of it. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his briefly, and then he picked up his coffee cup, and she picked up her paper, and they sat in the warm kitchen and talked about the grazing rotation for another half hour, because the rotation needed to be worked out before May 1st, and there were real decisions to make. That was, she thought, about as right as anything had ever felt. They married in April, not on any particular significant date. It was simply the Saturday that worked. The Saturday when the justice of the peace from Hartfield could make the ride out to the ranch, and when the weather was decent enough that standing on the porch was not a form of punishment. Margot Bell came, which surprised Evelyn slightly and did not surprise her at all. Ransom came with his wife, which surprised Caleb and did not surprise Evelyn. 6 hands stood in the yard in their best shirts, which ranged from passable to optimistic. DeWitt had made some effort with his hair that had not entirely succeeded, but demonstrated intention. Pike stood very straight and looked at the middle distance, the way he did when he was trying to manage an emotion he hadn't anticipated having. Manny stood with his hands folded and his face composed, and only the very slight brightness in his eyes indicated that he was moved by anything at all. Elsie stood on the porch step in her blue dress. She had put Evelyn's hair up that morning, or attempted to, with the focused seriousness of someone performing surgery, her small hands working pins into places where pins were needed, and several places where they were not, consulting periodically with a confidence that had no relationship to her actual expertise. The result was imperfect, and Evelyn had left it. Imperfect, because Elsie had done it, and imperfect was the right word for something made with that much care by someone learning. The ceremony was short. The justice of the peace was a man named Albright, who had married a significant portion of the territory's population over the past decade and had developed an efficient and not unkind style that moved through the necessary words without unnecessary ceremony. He asked the questions, they answered them. He said the words that made it legal and real and recorded. Caleb put a ring on her finger, a plain gold band, narrow, which he'd apparently had made in Cheyenne when he was there for the cattle exchange, which meant he'd been carrying it in his coat for 3 weeks. She only learned afterward, and which she filed away as a piece of information about Caleb Vale that she would think about later. She didn't cry. She was not a woman who cried easily, and this was not an occasion that made her want to start. But when she turned from the justice of the peace and saw Elsie on the step-saw, the expression on Elsie's face, which was everything the child had been carefully not expressing for months, all of it present at once, she looked away quickly and looked at the horizon, and gave herself 5 seconds to feel it fully before putting it away and turning back to the people who had come to stand with them. 5 seconds was enough. Summer came the way. Summer comes to the high plains, fast and total, replacing the spring's uncertainty with a heat that had no patience for negotiation. The grass grew. Cattle moved to the eastern boundary on Ransom's land and grazed on ground that was better than anything Iron Bar's own south pasture could have provided, and the south pasture rested and came back greener than it had been in 3 years, which Manny confirmed one morning in July by walking the whole of it and coming back and saying, "Good," which was Manny's version of an enthusiastic report. The herd was building. Not fast. There was nothing fast about rebuilding a cattle herd from 280, and anyone who told you otherwise was selling something. But steadily. The breeding program Evelyn had laid out in her notes was producing what it was supposed to produce, and by the end of summer the count was back to 312, and by the fall it would be higher. The ranch's operating costs were running 22% lower than they had the year before she arrived. She'd calculated this one evening in July, sitting at the kitchen table with the ledgers from the previous 2 years that she'd found in the desk, doing the comparison with the focused interest of someone who enjoys seeing a thing demonstrated in numbers that she already knew was true. 22% was a real number. It represented real decisions and real work, and the accumulation of dozens of small changes that had each seemed minor on their own and were collectively significant. She showed Caleb the calculation. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he said, "You were doing this math in November." "I was guessing in November." "This is confirmed." "You were guessing right in November." "Most of the time," she said. "Not always," he looked at her. "When were you wrong?" She thought about it. "The first estimate on the beef preservation. I thought we'd get 8 weeks of extended supply, and it was closer to 6.5. She paused, and I underestimated how much the feed situation would cost in March. My contingency was light. You still made it work. Making it work and being right are different things. She took the calculation back. I'd rather know where I was wrong so I can be right next time. He looked at her with that expression that had no simple name, the one that existed in the territory, between admiration and something that went further than admiration, but that Caleb Vale expressed through the quality of his attention, rather than any words that would have embarrassed both of them. "All right," he said. "Tell me about the contingency." She told him. They talked about it for an hour, and came out of it with a better model for the following winter's reserves, one that accounted for the variables she'd underestimated, and built a buffer that was real rather than theoretical. It was a good conversation, the kind they had regularly now, where the ranch's numbers were a shared language, and neither of them was working from information the other didn't have. That was the thing nobody talked about in the territory, when they talked about marriage. Not the feeling of it, people talked about the feeling endlessly, the romance of it, the ceremony, the beginning. What they didn't talk about was the daily substance of it, the shared language, the way two people could sit at a table with a ledger between them and both be fluent in what it meant and both have something to contribute to what it said. The specific trust of knowing that the other person was looking at the same reality you were looking at and not flinching from it. That was not a small thing. In her experience, it was not a common thing. She was grateful for it in the quiet, practical way. She was grateful for the things that worked. Fall market was good. Not exceptional. She had not built the summer plan on an exceptional fall, because building on exceptional was a way of planning for disappointment. She had built it on reasonable, and reasonable was what arrived. Cattle went to Cheyenne in October and came back as a number in the ledger that was, when set against the operating costs and the winter reserve and the next bank payment, sufficient, more than sufficient. By the 1st of November, Iron Bar Ranch had made its payment, replenished the winter reserves to a level she was genuinely comfortable with, rather than cautiously optimistic about, paid every hand the full wages owed, plus a small additional amount that Caleb called an end-of-season acknowledgement, and that DeWitt called a bonus, and that Pike called unexpected, and had a balance in the account at the Hartfield Bank under Caleb and Evelyn Vale, because that was how she'd insisted it be set up. Both names, the bank clerk had found unusual, and recorded without comment. That was the first real reserve the ranch had carried in 3 years. It was not a large reserve. Let's be honest about that. It was not the kind of reserve that made a person feel entirely safe, because safety on a cattle ranch in Wyoming in the 1880s was a weather event or a disease outbreak, or a market collapse away from being theoretical. The reserve was a margin, a hedge against the next bad thing, which would come because bad things always came. And the question was never whether you'd face them, but whether you had something to face them with. They had something. That was different from what they'd had a year ago. Genuinely, materially different. On the 1st of November one year, almost to the day, from when Evelyn had sat down on her trunk outside a chained gate in the freezing dark, she made breakfast for the household of Iron Bar Ranch. And Elsie rang the old bell at 11:30, and the men came in from the barn and the work, and they ate together in the way they'd been eating together since January, which was to say with the ease of people who had been through something and come out the other side and knew what that meant about each other. After the men went back out and Elsie had gone to the neighboring woman's house for her afternoon reading lesson, Evelyn sat at the kitchen table with her coffee, and she let herself be still for a moment. Thought about a thing she'd read once, years ago, in a book that had belonged to the boarding house's previous owner and been left behind on a shelf, about how people often mistake the dramatic moments of their lives. For the important ones, the crisis, the decision, the confrontation, the arrival, when the real substance of a life is built in the ordinary time between those moments, in the daily repetition of small choices that accumulate into something either solid or hollow, depending on what the choices are. She thought the person who wrote that was right, and also had probably never sat outside a chained gate in a Wyoming winter, with $11 in their boot and nowhere better to be. Because sometimes the dramatic moment is also the important one. Sometimes the crisis is the hinge, the whole thing turns on, and you can't understand what came after without understanding what it cost to get through it. What it had cost her, 3 months of work without pay and the choice to do it anyway, because the alternative was worse. What it had cost Caleb, $99 he didn't have, and a ride to Hartfield, harder than either of those. The willingness to stand in a cold street and say plainly that he had been wrong. What it had cost Elsie, nothing. Because Elsie had been right from the beginning in the uncomplicated way children are right when they haven't yet learned to protect themselves from what they want. She thought about what the year had actually been. Not the version you'd tell someone who asked how things were going, the version with the cleaned flu and the 60 saved and the spring market and the bank payment made. That version was true and was also not the whole truth. The whole truth was harder and simpler at the same time. A woman with nothing had arrived at a place that needed her, and she had worked, and the work had been good, and she had not been paid for it, and she had left because leaving was what her own dignity required, and she had come back. Because coming back was what her own honesty required. And a man who had been losing things for 3 years had finally done the thing that men who are used to losing things find most difficult, which was to ask someone else to stay. That was the actual story. The flour and the smokehouse and the ransom hay were evidence of the story. But they weren't the story itself. She thought about the women she knew who had come west, not many. But a few women who had made the decision that she'd made and arrived at various versions of what she'd arrived at. Some of them had found what they were looking for. Some of them had found something entirely different and made their peace with it or hadn't. Some of them had gone back east, and some of them had stayed, and some of them had gone somewhere else entirely and kept moving until they found the thing or stopped looking for it. She had found something she hadn't entirely been looking for, which was different from finding what you were looking for and was not worse. It was just a different thing. She'd come west for a job that had burned down and had found instead a ranch that had nearly burned down in a different way and had helped it not. She'd come looking for wages and found a household. She'd come alone and found a child who needed someone, and a man who had forgotten, temporarily and understandably, how to ask for help. She didn't think everything happened for a reason. She thought things happened, and then you made a reason out of them or you didn't, and the making was the work and the work was the life. Caleb came in at noon and found her sitting at the table. He looked at the coffee cup empty, which meant she'd been sitting a while, poured 2 fresh cups and sat across from her. Thinking, he said. Thinking. About what? She looked at him. About this time last year. He sat with that for a moment. He knew, because he knew her by now, that this was not a melancholy observation. It was the kind of thing she did, marking the distance between what had been and what was, measuring it, making sure it was real. Different, he said, very. He drank his coffee. Outside, the November sky was doing what November skies in Wyoming did, threatening something, and not yet delivering on it, the clouds building in the northwest with a slow patience that suggested they had a plan. Going to snow tonight, he said. I know. I checked the south fence this morning. The gap Reed was supposed to fix in October. I saw his repair on Monday. It's solid. He looked at her. When did you walk the south fence? Monday afternoon. I wanted to see the pasture recovery before the first snow covered it. He was quiet for a moment, and better than last year. Much better. She wrapped both hands around her coffee cup. If next summer is comparable to this one, and we hold to the breeding program, you'll be at 350 by the following fall. That's the number where the operation has real margin. 350, he said. He turned the number over. 2 years. 2 years if nothing goes wrong. 3 if something does. Something always goes wrong. Yes, she said. But we'll have the reserve to handle one wrong thing instead of none. She paused. That's the difference. Not that things stop going wrong. Just that one wrong thing doesn't end everything. He looked at her across the table. This was the conversation they had most often, not romantic, not dramatic, just the ongoing shared work of thinking about the ranch's future, turning it over together, the way you turn soil, looking at what's underneath. She'd come to understand that this was, for Caleb, the deepest form of trust he knew how to extend. Not the words that cost him. He'd said those in the street in Hartfield, and she'd taken them and was keeping them. But this, the open ledger, the shared numbers, the willingness to think about the future as something they were both building, rather than something that was happening to one of them. I want to put in a proper root cellar, she said, before spring. Agnes's box under the garden was the right idea, and it was too small. I know a man in Hartfield who does stonework. I know. Reed's mentioned him. I want to talk to him about dimensions. She looked at her cup. And I want to plant more next summer. The garden was minimal. With better soil preparation this fall and a root cellar to store to, we can cut the vegetable purchase costs by half. You're going to dig the garden in November? I'm going to prepare the soil in November, so it's ready in April. She looked at him. You could help. I don't know anything about gardens. I'll teach you what I know, which is not that much. We'll figure out the rest. He sat with this for a moment. Then he said, all right. That was how most things got decided between them. Not dramatically, just all right. And then they did the thing. And sometimes it worked the way they'd planned, and sometimes it didn't, and they adjusted and tried again, which was, she had come to believe, the only actual method available to anyone, no matter how much planning went into it. That evening, when the snow had started softly at first, then with more commitment, the kind of snow that meant business, Evelyn stood in the kitchen, and she looked at the shelf above the stove. 3 cups. One for Caleb, the battered tin mug he'd used since before she arrived, the one with the dent on the left side from some incident he'd never explained. One for Elsie, the blue one with the crack repaired with tree sap, Agnes's cup, which Elsie had claimed as her own sometime in the spring, with a matter-of-factness that had not required discussion. And one for Evelyn, the plain white cup that Elsie had moved to the shelf on a Thursday morning in December, before any of this had been settled or certain, when a 7-year-old child had understood something that none of the adults had been willing yet to say out loud. The space that had been between them on the shelf was gone. Some point in the spring, she couldn't recall exactly when the cups had shifted together, the 3 of them in a line, close enough that they touched at the rims when the wind came through the walls, and the shelf trembled slightly. She stood looking at them, and she thought about $11 in a boot lining, and a locked gate, and a plate of cold beef pushed through iron bars by a child who did not know her. And she thought about how long ago that was and how close it still felt. And she thought that this was probably how it always was with the things that changed your life. They stayed present in a way that the ordinary days didn't. Available when you needed to remember what the distance was and what it had cost to cover it. She turned back to the stove. Elsie came into the kitchen for her evening cup of warm milk, which was a ritual that had started in January during the fever and had never stopped, climbed onto her stool and sat with her elbows on the counter and watched Evelyn work with the comfortable attention of someone watching a familiar thing. Snowing, Elsie said. I know. Papa says we have enough feed. We do. He was checking the numbers again. He always checks the numbers. Evelyn poured the milk into the pan. Why the numbers are right. Elsie thought about this. Do you check them too? Different numbers. Same reason. Elsie accepted this. She took the warm milk when it was ready and wrapped both small hands around the cup, Agnes's blue cup, her cup now, and she drank it in the careful way she did everything, not spilling, not rushing. After a while she said, Are you happy here? Evelyn turned to look at her. The child was watching her with those gray-green eyes that saw most things and pretended to see less. The eyes that had been assessing her since the first day, through iron bars with a plate of cold beef. Yes, Evelyn said. It was the simplest answer and the truest one, and she didn't add anything to it because it didn't need anything added. Elsie nodded, as if this confirmed something she'd already calculated. She finished her milk and set the cup down and slid off the stool and said goodnight with the formality she maintained in the evenings, which was one of her particular qualities and one that Evelyn had stopped finding surprising and started finding simply characteristic, the way all the specific things about a person stop being notable and start being just the shape of who they are. Caleb came in from checking the barn at 9:30. Snow on his coat, his face cold from it. He hung up the coat, poured coffee. He sat at the desk with the ledger, the way he sat every evening, the pen moving across the columns. Evelyn finished the last of the kitchen work, and she sat at the table with her own paper, the running document, which had been updated that afternoon with the root cellar plan and the garden notes and the breeding program numbers through next fall. And she's worked in the lamplight while the snow came down outside, and the house held against it, the way this house had been holding against Wyoming winters for a long time, solid where it mattered, even if imperfect everywhere else, which was, she'd had decided about the best you could ask of anything. The ranch had not survived because someone came and rescued it. It had survived because 2 people who were each missing, something the other had, were willing to do the harder thing, which was not to need each other less, but to be honest about needing each other, and to make that honesty into something they could both stand on. That was the truth of it. Not a comfortable truth, and not a simple one, and and not the kind of truth that arrived already arranged. Kind you built, season by season out of whatever you had. Iron Bar Ranch was standing. That was enough. That had always been enough. If you were willing to do the work to get there,